Chapter 25 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. What! Are Ancient Pistol and you friends, yet? Shakespeare. The curtain of our imperfect drama must fall, to rise upon another scene. The time is advanced several days, during which very material changes had occurred in the situation of the actors. The hour is noon, and the place an elevated plain, that rose at no great distance from the water, somewhat abruptly from a fertile bottom, which stretched along the margin of one of the numberless watercourses of that region. The river took its rise near the base of the Rocky Mountains, and, after washing a vast extent of plain, it mingled its waters with a still larger stream, to become finally lost in the turbid current of the Missouri. The landscape was changed materially for the better, though the hand which had impressed so much of the desert on the surrounding region had laid a portion of its power on this spot. The appearance of vegetation was, however, less discouraging than in the more sterile waste of the rolling prairies. Clusters of trees were scattered in greater profusion, and a long outline of ragged forest marked the northern boundary of the view. Here and there on the bottom were to be seen the evidences of a hasty and imperfect culture of such indigenous vegetables as were of a quick growth, and which were known to flourish, without the aid of art, in deep and alluvial soils. On the very edge of what might be called the table land were pitched the 100 lodges of a horde of wandering Sioux. Their light tenements were arranged without the least attention to order. Proximity to the water seemed to be the only consideration which had been consulted in their disposition, nor had even this important convenience been always regarded. While most of the lodges stood along the brow of the plain, many were to be seen at greater distances, occupying such places as had first pleased the capricious eyes of the untutored owners. The encampment was not military, nor in the slightest degree protected from surprise by its position or defences. It was open on every side, and on every side as accessible as any other point in those wastes, if the imperfect and natural obstruction offered by the river be excepted. In short, the place bore the appearance of having been tenanted longer than its occupants had originally intended, while it was not wanting in the signs of readiness for a hasty or even a compelled departure. This was the temporary encampment of that portion of his people who had long been hunting under the direction of Matori, on those grounds which separated the stationary abodes of his nation from those of the warlike tribes of the Pawnees. The lodges were tents of skin, high, conical, and of the most simple and primitive construction. The shield, the quiver, the lance, and the bow of its master were to be seen suspended from a light post before the opening, or door, of each habitation. The different domestic implements of his 1, 2, or 3 wives, as the brave was of greater or lesser renown, were carelessly thrown at its side, and here and there the round, full, patient countenance of an infant might be found peeping from its comfortless wrappers of bark, as suspended by a deerskin thong from the same post. It rocked in the passing air. Children of a larger growth were tumbling over each other in piles, the males, even at that early age, making themselves distinguished for that species of domination which, in after life, was to mark the vast distinction between the sexes. Youths were in the bottom, essaying their juvenile powers in curbing the wild steeds of their fathers, while here and there a truant girl was to be seen stealing from her labours to admire their fierce and impatient daring. Thus far the picture was the daily exhibition of an encampment confident in its security, but immediately in front of the lodges was a gathering, that seemed to forebode some movements of more than usual interest. A few of the withered and remorseless crones of the band were clustering together, in readiness to lend their fell voices, if needed, to aid in exciting their descendants to an exhibition, which their depraved taste coveted, as the luxurious Roman dame witnessed the struggles and agony of the gladiator. The men were subdivided into groups, assorted according to the deeds and reputations of the several individuals of whom they were composed. They, who were of that equivocal age which admitted them to the hunts, while their discretion was still too doubtful to permit them to be trusted on the war-path, hung around the skirts of the whole, catching, from the fierce models before them, that gravity of demeanour and restraint of manner, which in time was to become so deeply engrafted in their own characters. A few of the still older class, and who had heard the whoop in anger, were a little more presuming, pressing nigher to the chiefs, though far from presuming to mingle in their councils, sufficiently distinguished by being permitted to catch the wisdom which fell from the lips so venerated. The ordinary warriors of the band were still less diffident, not hesitating to mingle among the chiefs of lesser note, though far from assuming the right to dispute the sentiments of any established brave, or to call in question the prudence of measures that were recommended by the more gifted counsellors of the nation. Among the chiefs themselves there was a singular compound of exterior. They were divided into two classes: those who were mainly indebted to their influence to physical causes, and to deeds in arms, and those who had become distinguished rather for their wisdom than for their services in the field. The former was by far the most numerous and the most important class. They were men of stature and mien, whose stern countenances were often rendered doubly imposing by those evidences of their valour, which had been roughly traced on their lineaments by the hands of their enemies. That class which had gained its influence by a moral ascendancy was extremely limited. They were uniformly to be distinguished by the quick and lively expression of their eyes, by the air of distrust that marked their movements, and occasionally by the vehemence of their utterance in those sudden outbreakings of the mind, by which their present consultations were, from time to time, distinguished. In the very centre of a ring, formed by these chosen counsellors, was to be seen the person of the disquieted, but seemingly calm, Matori. There was a conjunction of all the several qualities of the others in his person and character. Mind as well as matter had contributed to establish his authority. His scars were as numerous and deep as those of the whitest head in his nation. His limbs were in their greatest vigour. His courage at its fullest height. Endowed with this rare combination of moral and physical influence, the keenest eye in all that assembly was wont to lower before his threatening glance. Courage and cunning had established his ascendancy, and it had been rendered, in some degree, sacred by time. He knew so well how to unite the powers of reason and force, that in a state of society which admitted of a greater display of his energies, the Teton would in all probability have been both a conqueror and a despot. A little apart from the gathering of the band was to be seen a set of beings of an entirely different origin, taller and far more muscular in their persons. The lingering vestiges of their Saxon and Norman ancestry were yet to be found beneath the swarthy complexions which had been bestowed by an American sun. It would have been a curious investigation for one skilled in such an inquiry to have traced those points of difference by which the offspring of the most western European was still to be distinguished from the descendant of the most remote Asiatic, now that the two, in the revolutions of the world, were approximating in their habits, their residence, and not a little in their characters. The group, of whom we write, was composed of the family of the squatter. They stood indolent, lounging, and inert, as usual when no immediate demand was made on their dormant energies, clustered in front of some 4 or 5 habitations of skin, for which they were indebted to the hospitality of their Teton allies. The terms of their unexpected confederation were sufficiently explained by the presence of the horses and domestic cattle that were quietly grazing on the bottom beneath, under the jealous eyes of the spirited Hetty. Their wagons were drawn about the lodges in a sort of irregular barrier, which at once manifested that their confidence was not entirely restored, while, on the other hand, their policy or indolence prevented any very positive exhibition of distrust. There was a singular union of passive enjoyment and of dull curiosity slumbering in every dull countenance, as each of the party stood leaning on his rifle, regarding the movements of the Sioux conference. Still, no sign of expectation or interest escaped from the youngest among them, the whole appearing to emulate the most phlegmatic of their savage allies, in an exhibition of patience. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it was in some short and contemptuous remark, which served to put the physical superiority of a white man and that of an Indian in a sufficiently striking point of view. In short, the family of Ishmael appeared now to be in the plenitude of an enjoyment which depended on inactivity, but which was not entirely free from certain confused glimmerings of a perspective, in which their security stood in some little danger of a rude interruption from Teton treachery. Abiram alone formed a solitary exception to this state of equivocal repose. After a life passed in the commission of 1,000 mean and insignificant villainies, the mind of the kidnapper had become hardy enough to attempt the desperate adventure which has been laid before the reader in the course of the narrative. His influence over the bolder but less active spirit of Ishmael was far from great, and had not the latter been suddenly expelled from a fertile bottom, of which he had taken possession, with intent to keep it, without much deference to the forms of law, he would never have succeeded in enlisting the husband of his sister in an enterprise that required so much decision and forethought. Their original success and subsequent disappointment have been seen, and Abiram now sat apart, plotting the means by which he might secure to himself the advantages of his undertaking, which he perceived were each moment becoming more uncertain, through the open admiration of Matori for the innocent subject of his villainy. We shall leave him to his vacillating and confused expedients, in order to pass to the description of certain other personages in the drama. There was still another corner of the picture that was occupied. On a little bank, at the extreme right of the encampment, lay the forms of Middleton and Paul. Their limbs were painfully bound with thongs, cut from the skin of a bison, while, by a sort of refinement and cruelty, they were so placed that each could see a reflection of his own misery in the case of his neighbour. Within a dozen yards of them a post was set firmly in the ground, and against it was bound the light and Apollo-like person of Hard Heart. Between the two stood the trapper, deprived of his rifle, his pouch, and his horn, but otherwise left in a sort of a contemptuous liberty. Some 5 or 6 young warriors, however, with quivers at their backs, and long tough bows dangling from their shoulders, who stood with grave watchfulness at no great distance from the spot, sufficiently proclaim how fruitless any attempt to escape, on the part of one so aged and so feeble, might prove. Unlike the other spectators of the important conference, these individuals were engaged in a discourse that for them contained an interest of its own. "Captain," said the bee hunter, with an expression of comical concern, that no misfortune could depress in one of his buoyant feelings, "do you really find that accursed strap of untanned leather cutting into your shoulder, or is it only the ticking of my own arm that I feel?" "When the spirit suffers so deeply, the body is insensible to pain," returned a more refined, though scarcely so spirited, Middleton. "Would to Heaven that some of my trusty artillerists might fall upon this accursed encampment!" "You might as well wish that these Teton lodges were so many hives of hornets, and that the insects would come forth and battle with yonder tribe of half-naked savages." Then, chuckling with his own conceit, the bee hunter turned away from his companion, and sought a momentary relief from his misery, by imagining that so wild an idea might be realized, and fancying the manner in which the attack would upset even the well-established patience of an Indian. Middleton was glad to be silent, but the old man, who had listened to their words, drew a little nigher, and continued the discourse. "Here is likely to be a merciless and hellish business," he said, shaking his head in a manner to prove that even his experience was at a loss for a remedy in so trying a dilemma. "Our Pawnee friend is already staked for the torture, and I well know, by the eye and the countenance of the great Sioux, that he is leading on the temper of his people to further enormities." "Harkee, old trapper," said Paul, writhing in his bonds to catch a glimpse of the other's melancholy face, "you are skilled in Indian tongues, and know somewhat of Indian deviltries. Go you to the council and tell their chiefs in my name, that is to say, in the name of Paul Hover of the State of Kentucky, that provided they will guarantee the safe return of one Ellen Wade into the States, they are welcome to take his scalp when, in such a manner as best suits their amusements. Or, if so be they will not trade on these conditions, you may throw in an hour or 2 of torture beforehand, in order to sweeten the bargain to their damnable appetites." "Ah, lad, it is little they would hearken to such an offer, knowing as they do that you are already like a bear in a trap, as little able to fight as to fly. But be not downhearted, for the colour of white man is sometimes his death warrant among these far tribes of savages, and sometimes his shield. Though they love us not, cunning often ties their hands. Could the red nations work their will, trees would shortly be growing again on the ploughed fields of America, and woods would be whitened with Christian bones. No one can doubt that, who knows the quality of the love which a red-skin bears a pale-face. But they have counted our numbers until their memories fail them, and they are not without their policy. Therefore is our fate unsettled. But I fear me there is small hope left for the Pawnee." As the old man concluded, he walked slowly towards the subject of his latter observation. taking his post at no great distance from his side. Here he stood, observing such a silence and mien as became him to manifest, to a chief so renowned and so situated as his captive associate. But the eye of Hard Heart was fastened on the distance, and his whole air was that of one whose thoughts were entirely removed from the present scene. "The Siouxes are in council on my brother," the trapper at length observed, when he found he could only attract the other's attention by speaking. The young partisan turned his head with a calm smile, as he answered, "They are counting the scalps over the lodge of Hard Heart." "No doubt, no doubt. Their tempers begin to mount, as they remember the number of Tetons you have struck, and better would it be for you now, had more of your days been spent in chasing the deer, and fewer on the war-path. Then some childless mother of this tribe might take you in place of her lost son, and your time would be filled in peace." "Does my father think that a warrior can ever die? The Master of Life does not open his hand to take away his gifts again. When he wants his young men, he calls them, and they go. But the Red-skin he has once breathed on lives forever." "Ay, this is a more comfortable and a more humble faith than that which yonder heartless Teton harbours. There is something in these Loups which opens my inmost heart to them. They seem to have the courage, ay, and the honesty too, of Delawares of the hills. And this lad, it is wonderful, it is very wonderful, but the age, and the eye, and the limbs are as if they might have been brothers. Tell me, Pawnee, have you ever in your traditions heard of a mighty people who once lived on the shores of the Salt Lake, hard by the rising sun?" "The earth is white, by people of the colour of my father." "Nay, nay, I speak not now of any strollers who have crept into the land to rob the lawful owners of their birthright, but of a people who are, or rather were, what with nature and what with paint, red as the berry on the bush." "I have heard the old men say, that there were bands who hid themselves in the woods under the rising sun, because they dared not come upon the open prairies to fight with men." "Do not your traditions tell you of the greatest, the bravest, and the wisest nation of Redskins that the Wahcondah has ever breathed upon?" Hard Heart raised his head, with a loftiness and dignity that even his bonds could not repress, as he answered, "Has age blinded my father, or does he see so many Siouxes, that he believes there are no longer any Pawnees?" "Ah, such is mortal vanity and pride!" exclaimed the disappointed old man, in English. "Nature is as strong in a Red-skin as in the bosom of a man of white gifts. Now would a Delaware conceit himself far mightier than a Pawnee, just as a Pawnee boasts himself to be of the princess of the 'arth? And so it was atween the Frenchers of the Canadas and the red-coated English, that the king did use to send into the States, when States they were not, but outcrying and petitioning provinces, they fought and they fought, and what marvellous boastings did they give forth to the world of their own valour and victories, while both parties forgot to name the humble soldier of the land, who did the real service, but who, as he was not privileged then to smoke at the great council fire of his nation, seldom heard of his deeds after they were once bravely done." When the old man had thus given vent to the nearly dormant, but far from extinct, military pride, that had so unconsciously led him into the very error he deprecated, his eye, which had begun to quicken and glimmer with some of the ardour of his youth, softened, and turned its anxious look on the devoted captive, whose countenance was also restored to its former cold look of abstraction and thought. "Young warrior," he continued in a voice that was growing tremulous, "I have never been father or brother. The Wahcondah made me to live alone. He never tied my heart to house or field, by the cords with which the men of my race are bound to their lodges. If he had, I should not have journeyed so far and seen so much. But I have tarried long among a people who lived in those woods you mention, and much reason did I find to imitate their courage and love their honesty. The Master of Life has made us all, Pawnee, with a feeling for our kind. I never was a father, but well do I know what is the love of one. You are like a lad I valued, and I had even begun to fancy that some of his blood might be in your veins. But what matters that? You are a true man, as I know by the way in which you keep your faith, and honesty is a gift too rare to be forgotten. My heart yearns to you, boy, and gladly would I do you good." The youthful warrior listened to the words, which came from the lips of the other, with a force and simplicity that established their truth, and he bowed his head on his naked bosom, in testimony of the respect with which he met the proffer. Then, lifting his dark eye to the level of the view, he seemed to be again considering of things removed from every personal consideration. The trapper, who well knew how high the pride of a warrior would sustain him, in those moments he believed to be his last, awaited the pleasure of his young friend, with a meekness and patience that he had acquired by his association with that remarkable race. At length the gaze of the Pawnee began to waver, and then quick, flashing glances were turned from the countenance of the old man to the air, and from the air to his deeply marked lineaments again, as if the spirit which governed their movements was beginning to be troubled. "Father," the young brave finally answered in a voice of confidence and kindness, "I have heard your words. They have gone in at my ears and are now within me. The white-headed Long knife has no son. The Hard Heart of the Pawnees is young, but he is already the oldest of his family. He found the bones of his father on the hunting ground of the Osages, and he has sent them to the prairies of the Good Spirits. No doubt the great chief, his father, has seen them, and knows what is part of himself. But the Wahcondah will soon call to us both; you, because you have seen all that is to be seen in this country, and Hard Heart, because he has need of a warrior who is young. There is no time for the Pawnee to show the Pale face the duty that a son owes to his father. Old as I am, and miserable and helpless as I now stand, to what I once was, I may live to see the sun go down in the prairie. Does my son expect to do as much?" "The Tetons are counting the scalps on my lodge," returned the young chief, with a smile whose melancholy was singularly illuminated by a gleam of triumph. "And they find them many, too many for the safety of its owner, while he is in their revengeful hands. My son is not a woman, and he looks on the path he is about to travel with a steady eye. Has he nothing to whisper in the ears of his people, before he starts? These legs are old, but they may yet carry me to the forks of the Loup River." "Tell them that the Hard Heart has tied a knot in his wampum for every Teton," burst from the lips of the captive, with that vehemence with which sudden passion is known to break through the barriers of artificial restraint. "If he meets one of them all in the prairies of the Master of Life, his heart will become Sioux." "Ah, that feeling would be a dangerous companion, for a man with white gifts to start with on so solemn a journey," muttered the old man in English. "This is not what the good Moravians said to the councils of the Delawares, nor what is so often preached to the white skins in the settlements, though, to the shame of the colour be it said, it is so little heeded. Pawnee, I love you, but being a Christian man, I cannot be the runner to bear such a message." "If my father is afraid the Tetons will hear him, let him whisper it softly to our old men." "As for fear, young warrior, it is no more the shame of a Pale face than of a Red skin. The Wahcondah teaches us to love the life he gives, but it is as men love their hunts, and their dogs, and their carbines, and not with the doting that a mother looks upon her infant. The Master of Life will not have to speak aloud twice when he calls my name. I am as ready to answer it now as I shall be to-morrow, or at any time it may please his mighty will. But what is a warrior without his traditions? Mine forbid me to carry your words." The chief made a dignified motion of assent, and here there was great danger that those feelings of confidence, which had been so singularly awakened, would as suddenly subside. But the heart of the old man had been too sensibly touched, through long dormant but still living recollections, to break off the communication so rudely. He pondered for a minute, and then, bending his look wistfully on his young associate, again continued. "Each warrior must be judged by his gifts. I have told my son what I cannot, but let him open his ears to what I can do. An elk shall not measure the prairie much swifter than these old legs, if the Pawnee will give me a message that a white man may bear." "Let the Pale face listen," returned the other, after hesitating a single instant longer, under a lingering sensation of his former disappointment. "He will stay here till the Sioux have done counting the scalps of their dead warriors. He will wait until they have tried to cover the heads of 18 Tetons with the skin of one Pawnee. He will open his eyes wide, that he may see the place where they bury the bones of a warrior." "All this will I, and may I, do, noble boy." "He will mark the spot, that he may know it." No fear that I shall forget the place. interrupted the other, whose fortitude began to give way under so trying an exhibition of calmness and resignation. "Then I know that my father will go to my people. His head is grey, and his words will not be blown away with the smoke. Let him get on my lodge, and call the name of Hard Heart aloud. No Pawnee will be deaf. Then let my father ask for the colt that has never been ridden, but which is sleeker than the buck and swifter than the elk." "I understand you, boy, I understand you," interrupted the attentive old man, "and what you say shall be done. Ay, and well done, too, or I'm but little skilled in the wishes of a dying Indian." "And when my young men have given my father the halter of the colt, he will lead him by a crooked path to the grave of Hard Heart?" "Will I? Ay, that I will, brave youth, though the winter covers these plains in banks of snow, and the sun is hidden as much by day as by night. To the head of the holy spot will I lead the beast, and place him with his eyes looking towards the setting sun." "And my father will speak to him, and tell him that the master, who has fed him since he was foaled, has now need of him." "That too will I do, though the Lord he knows that I shall hold discourse with a horse, not with any vain conceit that my words will be understood, but only to satisfy the cravings of Indian superstition. Hector, my pup, what think you, dog, of talking to a horse?" "Let the grey beard speak to him with the tongue of a Pawnee," interrupted the young victim, perceiving that his companion had used an unknown language for the preceding speech. "My son's will shall be done, and these old hands, which I had hoped had nearly done with bloodshed, whether it be of man or beast, will I slay the animal on your grave." "It is good," returned the other, a gleam of satisfaction flitting across his features. "Hard Heart will ride his horse to the blessed prairies, and he will come before the Master of Life like a chief." The sudden and striking change which instantly occurred in the countenance of the Indian caused the trapper to look aside, when he perceived that the conference of the Sioux had ended, and that Matori, attended by one or two of the principal warriors, was deliberately approaching his intended victim. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. I am not prone to weeping as our sex commonly are, but I have that honorable grief lodged here, which burns worse than tears drown. Shakespeare. When within 20 feet of the prisoners, the Tetons stopped, and their leader made a sign to the old man to draw nigh. The trapper obeyed, quitting the young Pawnee with a significant look, which was received, as it was meant, for an additional pledge that he would never forget his promise. So soon as Matori found that the other had stopped within reach of him, he stretched forth his arm, and laying a hand upon the shoulder of the attentive old man, he stood regarding him a minute, with eyes that seemed willing to penetrate the recesses of his most secret thoughts. "Is a pale-face always made with 2 tongues?" he demanded, when he found that, as usual, with the subject of this examination, he was as little intimidated by his present frown as moved by any apprehensions of the future. "Honesty lies deeper than the skin." "It is so. Now let my father hear me. Matori has but 1 tongue. The grey-head has many. They may be all straight, and none of them forked. A Sioux is no more than a Sioux, but a pale-face is everything. He can talk to the Pawnee and the Konza and the Omawa, and he can talk to his own people. Ay, there are linguists in the settlements that can do still more. But what profits it all? The Master of Life has an ear for every language. The grey-head has done wrong. He has said one thing when he met another. He has looked before him with his eyes, and behind him with his mind. He has ridden the horse of a Sioux too hard. He has been a friend of a Pawnee, and the enemy of my people. Teton, I am your prisoner. Though my words are white, they will not complain. Act your will." "No, Matori will not make a white hair red. My father is free. The prairie is open on every side of him. But before the grey-head turns his back on the Sioux, let him look well at them, that he may tell his own chief how great is a Dahcotah. I am not in a hurry to go on my path. You see a man with a white head, and no woman, Teton. Therefore shall I not run myself out of breath, to tell the nations of the prairies what the Sioux are doing? It is good. My father has smoked with the chiefs at many councils, returned Matori, who now thought himself sufficiently sure of the other's favour to go more directly to his object. Matori will speak with the tongue of his very dear friend and father. A young pale-face will listen when an old man of that nation opens his mouth. Go. My father will make what a poor Indian says fit for a white ear. Speak aloud, said the trapper, who readily understood the metaphorical manner, in which the Teton expressed a desire that he should become an interpreter of his words into the English language. Speak, my young men, listen. Now, captain, and you too, friend bee-hunter, prepare yourselves to meet the deviltries of this savage with the stout hearts of white warriors. If you find yourselves giving way under his threats, just turn your eyes on that noble-looking Pawnee, whose time is measured with a hand as niggardly as that with which a trader in the towns gives forth the fruits of the Lord, inch by inch, in order to satisfy his covetousness. A single look at the boy will set you both up in a resolution. My brother has turned his eyes on the wrong path, interrupted Matori, with a complacency that betrayed how unwilling he was to offend his intended interpreter. The Dahcotah will speak to my young men, after he has sung in the ear of the flower of the pale-faces. The Lord forgive the desperate villain, exclaimed the old man in English. There are none so tender, or so young, or so innocent, as to escape his ravenous wishes. But hard words and cold looks will profit nothing. Therefore it will be wise to speak him fair. Let Matori open his mouth. Would my father cry out that the women and children should hear the wisdom of chiefs? We will go into the lodge and whisper." As the Teton ended, he pointed significantly towards a tent, vividly emblazoned with the history of one of his own boldest and most commended exploits, and which stood a little apart from the rest as if to denote it was the residence of some privileged individual of the band. The shield and the quiver at its entrance were richer than common, and the high distinction of a fusee attested the importance of its proprietor. In every other particular it was rather distinguished by signs of poverty than of wealth. The domestic utensils were fewer in number and simpler in their forms than those to be seen about the openings of the meanest lodges, nor was there a single one of those high-priced articles of civilized life, which were occasionally bought of the traders, in bargains that bore so hard on the ignorant natives. All these had been bestowed, as they had been acquired, by the generous chief on his subordinates, to purchase an influence that might render him the master of their lives and persons, a species of wealth that was certainly more noble in itself, and far dearer to his ambition. The old man well knew this to be the lodge of Matori, and, in obedience to the sign of the chief, he held his way towards it with slow and reluctant steps. But there were others present, who were equally interested in the approaching conference, whose apprehensions were not to be so easily suppressed. The watchful eye and jealous ears of Middleton had taught him enough to fill his soul with horrible forebodings. With an incredible effort he succeeded in gaining his feet, and called aloud to the retiring trapper. "I conjure you, old man, if the love you bore my parents was more than words, or if the love you bear your God is that of a Christian man, utter not a syllable that may wound the ear of that innocent—" Exhausted in spirit, and fettered in limbs, he then fell, like an inanimate log, to the earth, where he lay like one dead. Paul had, however, caught the clue, and completed the exhortation in his peculiar manner. "Harkee, old trapper," he shouted, vainly endeavouring at the same time to make a gesture of defiance with his hand. "If you are about to play the interpreter, speak such words to the ears of that damnable savage, as becomes a white man to use, and a heathen to hear. Tell him, from me, that if he does or says the thing that is uncivil to the girl, called Nellie Wade, that I'll curse him with my dying breath; that I'll pray for all good Christians in Kentucky to curse him, sitting and standing, eating and drinking, fighting and praying, or at horse races, indoors and outdoors, in summer or winter, or In the month of March. In short, I'll say, ay, it are a fact morally true. I'll haunt him, if the ghost of a Pale face can contrive to lift itself from a grave made by the hands of a Red skin." Having thus ventured the most terrible denunciation he could devise, and the one which, in the eyes of the honest bee hunter, there seemed the greatest likelihood of his being able to put in execution, he was obliged to await the fruits of his threat, with that resignation which would be apt to govern a western border man, who, in addition to the prospects just named, had the advantage of contemplating them in fetters and bondage. We shall not detain the narrative, to relate the quaint morals, with which he next endeavoured to cheer the drooping spirits of his more sensitive companion, or the occasional pithy and peculiar benedictions that he pronounced, on all the bands of the Dahcotahs, commencing with those whom he accused of stealing or murdering on the banks of the distant Mississippi, and concluding, in terms of suitable energy, with the Teton tribe. The latter more than once received from his lips curses as sententious and as complicated as that celebrated anathema of the church, for a knowledge of which most unlettered Protestants are indebted to the pious researches of the worthy Tristram Shandy. But as Middleton recovered from his exhaustion, he was fain to appease the boisterous temper of his associate, by admonishing him of the uselessness of such denunciations, and of the possibility of their hastening the very evil he deprecated, by irritating the resentments of a race who were sufficiently fierce and lawless, even in their most pacific moods. In the meantime, the trapper and the Sioux chief pursued their way to the lodge. The former had watched with painful interest the expression of Matori's eye, while the words of Middleton and Paul were pursuing their footsteps, but the mien of the Indian was far too much restrained and self-guarded, to permit the smallest of his emotions to escape through any of those ordinary outlets, by which the condition of the human volcano is commonly betrayed. His look was fastened on the little habitation they approached, and, for the moment, his thoughts appeared to brood alone on the purposes of this extraordinary visit. The appearance of the interior of the lodge corresponded with its exterior. It was larger than most of the others, more finished in its form, and finer in its materials, but there its superiority ceased. Nothing could be more simple and republican than the form of living that the ambitious and powerful Teton chose to exhibit to the eyes of his people. A choice collection of weapons for the chase, some 3 or 4 medals, bestowed by the traders and political agents of the Canadas as a homage to, or rather as an acknowledgment of, his rank, with a few of the most indispensable articles of personal accommodation, composed its furniture. It abounded in neither venison nor the wild beef of the prairies, its crafty owner having well understood that the liberality of a single individual would be abundantly rewarded by the daily contributions of a band. Although as preeminent in the chase as in a war, a deer or a buffalo was never seen to enter whole into his lodge. In return, an animal was rarely brought into the encampment that did not contribute to support the family of Matori. But the policy of the chief seldom permitted more to remain than sufficed for the wants of the day. Perfectly assured that all must suffer before hunger, the bane of savage life could lay its fell fangs on so important a victim. Immediately beneath the favourite bow of the chief, and encircled in a sort of magical ring of spears, shields, lances, and arrows, all of which had in their time done good service, was suspended the mysterious and sacred medicine bag. It was highly wrought in wampum, and profusely ornamented with beads and porcupine quills, after the most cunning devices of Indian ingenuity. The peculiar freedom of Matori's religious creed has been more than once intimated, and by a singular species of contradiction, he appeared to have lavished his attentions on this emblem of a supernatural agency in a degree that was precisely inverse to his faith. It was merely the manner in which the Sioux imitated the well-known expedient of the Pharisees, in order that they may be seen of men. The tent had not, however, been entered by its owner since its return from the recent expedition. As the reader has already anticipated, it had been made the prison of Inez and Ellen. The bride of Middleton was seated on a simple couch of sweet-scented herbs, covered with skins. She had already suffered so much, and witnessed so many wild and unlooked-for events, within the short space of her captivity, that every additional misfortune fell with a diminished force on her seemingly devoted head. Her cheeks were bloodless, her dark and usually animated eye was contracted in an expression of settled concern, and her form appeared shrinking and sensitive. nearly to extinction. But in the midst of these evidences of natural weaknesses, there were at times such an air of pious resignation, such gleams of meek but holy hope lighting her countenance, as might well have rendered it a question whether the hapless captive was most the subject of pity or of admiration. All the precepts of Father Ignatius were riveted in her faithful memory, and not a few of his pious visions were floating before her imagination. Sustained by so sacred resolutions, the mild, the patient, and the confiding girl was bowing her head to this new stroke of Providence, with the same sort of meekness as she would have submitted to any other prescribed penitence for her sins, though nature, at moments, warred powerfully with so compelled a humility. On the other hand, Ellen had exhibited far more of the woman, and consequently of the passions of the world. She had wept until her eyes were swollen and red. Her cheeks were flushed and angry, and her whole mien was distinguished by an air of spirit and resentment, that was not a little, however, qualified by apprehensions for the future. In short, there was that about the eye and the step of the betrothed of Paul, which gave a warranty that should happier times arrive, and the constancy of the bee hunter finally meet with its reward, he would possess a partner every way worthy to cope with his own thoughtless and buoyant temperament. There was still another and a third figure in that little knot of females. It was the youngest, the most highly gifted, and, until now, the most favoured of the wives of the Teton. Her charms had not been without the most powerful attraction in the eyes of her husband, until they had so unexpectedly opened on the surpassing loveliness of a woman of the pale-faces. From that hapless moment, the graces, the attachment, the fidelity of the young Indian had lost their power to please. Still, the complexion of Tachechana, though less dazzling than that of her rival, was, for her race, clear and healthy. Her hazel eye had the sweetness and playfulness of the antelopes. Her voice was soft and joyous as the song of the wren, and her happy laugh was the very melody of the forest. Of all the Sioux girls, Tachechana, or the Fawn, was the lightest hearted and the most envied. Her father had been a distinguished brave, and her brothers had already left their bones on a distant and dreary war-path. Numberless were the warriors who had sent presents to the lodge of her parents, but none of them were listened to until a messenger from the great Matori had come. She was his third wife, it is true, but she was confessedly the most favoured of them all. Their union had existed but 2 short seasons, and its fruits now lay sleeping at her feet, wrapped in the customary ligatures of skin and bark, which formed the swaddlings of an Indian infant. At the moment when Matori and the trapper arrived at the opening of the lodge, the young Sioux wife was seated on a simple stool, turning her soft eyes with looks that varied, like her emotions, with love and wonder, from the unconscious child to those rare beings, who had filled her youthful and uninstructed mind with so much admiration and astonishment. Though Inez and Ellen had passed an entire day in her sight, it seemed as if the longings of her curiosity were increasing with each new gaze. She regarded them as beings of an entirely different nature and condition from the females of the prairie. Even the mystery of their complicated attire had its secret influence on her simple mind, though it was the grace and charms of sex, to which nature has made every people so sensible, that most attracted her admiration. But while her ingenuous disposition freely admitted the superiority of the strangers over the less brilliant attractions of the Dahcotah maidens, she had seen no reason to deprecate their advantages. The visit that she was about to receive was the first which her husband had made to the tent since his return from the recent inroad, and he was ever present to her thoughts, as a successful warrior, who was not ashamed in the moments of inaction to admit the softer feelings of a father and a husband. We have everywhere endeavoured to show that while Matori was in all essentials a warrior of the prairies, he was much in advance of his people in those acquirements which announced the dawnings of civilisation. He had held frequent communion with the traders and troops of the Canadas, and the intercourse had unsettled many of those wild opinions which were his birthright, without perhaps substituting any others of a nature sufficiently definite to be profitable. His reasoning was rather subtle than true, and his philosophy far more audacious than profound. Like thousands of more enlightened beings, who fancy they are able to go through the trials of human existence without any other support than their own resolutions, his morals were accommodating and his motive selfish. These several characteristics will be understood always with reference to the situation of the Indian, though little apology is needed for finding resemblances between men who essentially possess the same nature, however it may be modified by circumstances. Notwithstanding the presence of Inez and Ellen, the entrance of the Teton warrior into the lodge of his favourite wife was made with the tread and mien of a master. The step of his moccasin was noiseless, but the rattling of his bracelets and of the silver ornaments of his leggings sufficed to announce his approach, as he pushed aside the skin covering of the opening of the tent, and stood in the presence of its inmates. A faint cry of pleasure burst from the lips of Tachechana in the suddenness of her surprise, but the emotion was instantly suppressed in that subdued demeanour which should characterise a matron of her tribe. Instead of returning the stolen glance of his youthful and secretly rejoicing wife, Matori moved to the couch, occupied by his prisoners, and placed himself in the haughty, upright attitude of an Indian chief, before their eyes. The old man had glided past him, and already taken a position suited to the office he had been commanded to fill. Surprise kept the female silent and nearly breathless. Though accustomed to the sight of savage warriors in the hard panoply of their terrible profession, there was something so startling in the entrance, and so audacious in the inexplicable look of their conqueror, that the eyes of both sunk to the earth, under a feeling of terror and embarrassment. Then Inez recovered herself, and addressing the trapper, she demanded, with the dignity of an offended gentlewoman, though with her accustomed grace, to what circumstance they owed this extraordinary and unexpected visit. The old man hesitated, but clearing his throat like one who was about to make an effort to which he was little used, he ventured on the following reply. "Lady," he said, "a savage is a savage, and you are not to look for the uses and formalities of the settlements on a bleak and windy prairie. As these Indians would say, fashions and courtesies are things so light that they would blow away. As for myself, though a man of the forest, I have seen the ways of the great in my time, and I am not to learn that they differ from the ways of the lowly. I was long a serving man in my youth, not one of your beck and nod runners about a household, but a man that went through the servitude of the forest with his officer, and well do I know in what manner to approach the wife of a captain. Now, had I the ordering of this visit, I would first have him allowed at the door, in order that you might hear the strangers were coming, and then I—" "The manner is indifferent," interrupted Inez, too anxious to await the prolix explanations of the old man. "Why is the visit made?" "Therein shall the savage speak for himself. The daughters of the Pale-faces wish to know why the great Teton has come into his lodge." Matori regarded his interrogator with a surprise, which showed how extraordinary he deemed the question. Then, placing himself in a posture of condescension, after a moment's delay, he answered— "Sing in the ears of the dark eye. Tell her the lodge of Matori is very large, and that it is not full. She shall find room in it, and none shall be greater than she. Tell the light hair that she too may stay in the lodge of a brave, and eat of his venison. Matori is a great chief; his hand is never shut." "Teton," returned the trapper, shaking his head in evidence of the strong disapprobation with which he heard this language. "The tongue of a Red-skin must be coloured white, before it can make music in the ears of a Pale-face. Should your words be spoken, my daughters would shut their ears, and Matori would seem a traitor to their eyes. Now listen to what comes from a grey-head, and then speak accordingly. My people is a mighty people. The sun rises on their eastern and sets on their western border. The land is filled with bright-eyed and laughing girls, like these you see. Ay, Teton, I tell no lie," observing his auditor to start with an air of distrust, "bright-eyed and pleasant to behold as these before you." "Has my father 100 wives?" interrupted the savage, laying his finger on the shoulder of the trapper, with a look of curious interest in the reply. "No, Dahcotah, the Master of Life has said to me, live alone. Your lodge shall be the forest, the roof of your wigwam the clouds. But though never bound in the secret faith which, in my nation, ties one man to one woman, often have I seen the workings of that kindness which brings the two together. Go into the regions of my people. You will see the daughters of the land fluttering through the towns like many-coloured and joyful birds in the season of blossoms. You will meet them singing and rejoicing along the great paths of the country, and you will hear the woods ringing with their laughter. They are very excellent to behold, and the young men find pleasure in looking at them. "Hugh!" ejaculated the attentive Matori. "Ay, well may you put faith in what you hear, for it is no lie. But when a youth has found a maiden to please him, he speaks to her in a voice so soft, that none else can hear. He does not say, my lodge is empty and there is room for another, but shall I build, and will the virgin show me near what spring she would dwell? His voice is sweeter than honey from the locust, and goes into the ear thrilling like the song of a wren. Therefore, if my brother wishes his words to be heard, he must speak with a white tongue." Matori pondered deeply, and in a wonder that he did not attempt to conceal. It was reversing all the order of society, and, according to his established opinions, endangering the dignity of a chief, for a warrior thus to humble himself before a woman. But as Inez sat before him, reserved and imposing in air, utterly unconscious of his object, and least of all suspecting the true purport of so extraordinary a visit, the savage felt the influence of a manner to which he was unaccustomed. Bowing his head in acknowledgment of his error, he stepped a little back, and placing himself in an attitude of easy dignity, he began to speak with the confidence of one who had been no less distinguished for eloquence than for deeds in arms. Keeping his eyes riveted on the unconscious bride of Middleton, he proceeded in the following words. "I am a man with a red skin, but my eyes are dark. They have been opened since many snows. They have seen many things. They know a brave from a coward. When a boy, I saw nothing but the bison and the deer. I went to the hunts, and I saw the cougar and the bear. This made Matori a man. He talked with his mother no more. His ears were open to the wisdom of the old men. They told him everything. They told him of the Big Knives. He went on the war-path. He was then the last. Now he is the first. What Dahcotah dare say he will go before Matori into the hunting grounds of the Pawnees? The chiefs met him at their doors, and they said, my son is without a home. They gave him their lodges, they gave him their riches, and they gave him their daughters. Then Matori became a chief, as his fathers had been. He struck the warriors of all the nations, and he could have chosen wives from the Pawnees, the Omahaws, and the Konzas, but he looked at the hunting grounds, and not at his village. He thought a horse was pleasanter than a Dahcotah girl. But he found a flower on the prairies, and he plucked it, and brought it into his lodge. He forgets that he is the master of a single horse. He gives them all to the stranger, for Matori is not a thief. He will only keep the flower he found on the prairie. Her feet are very tender. She cannot walk to the door of her father. She will stay in the lodge of a valiant warrior forever." When he had finished this extraordinary address, the Teton awaited to have it translated, with the air of a suitor who entertained no very disheartening doubts of his success. The trapper had not lost a syllable of the speech, and he now prepared himself to render it into English in such a manner as should leave its principal idea even more obscure than in the original. But as his reluctant lips were in the act of parting, Ellen lifted a finger, and with a keen glance from her quick eye, at the still attentive Inez, she interrupted him. "Spare your breath," she said. "All that a savage says is not to be repeated before a Christian lady." Inez started, blushed, and bowed with an air of reserve, as she coldly thanked the old man for his intentions, and observed that she could now wish to be alone. "My daughters have no need of ears to understand what a great Dahcotah says," returned the trapper, addressing himself to the expecting Matori. "The look he has given, and the signs he has made, are enough. They understand him, they wish to think of his words, for the children of great braves, such as their fathers are, do nothing without much thought." With this explanation, so flattering to the energy of his eloquence, and so promising to his future hopes, the Teton was every way content. He made the customary ejaculation of assent, and prepared to retire. Saluting the females, in the cold but dignified manner of his people, he drew his robe about him, and moved from the spot where he had stood, with an air of ill-concealed triumph. But there had been a stricken, though a motionless and unobserved auditor of the foregoing scene. Not a syllable had fallen from the lips of the long and anxiously expected husband, that had not gone directly to the heart of his unoffending wife. In this manner had he wooed her from the lodge of her father, and it was to listen to similar pictures of the renown and deeds of the greatest brave in her tribe, that she had shut her ears to the tender tales of so many of the Sioux youths. As the Teton turned to leave his lodge, in the manner just mentioned, he found his unexpected and half-forgotten object before him. She stood in the humble guise, and with the shrinking air of an Indian girl, holding the pledge of their former love in her arms, directly in his path. Starting, the chief regained the marble-like indifference of countenance, which distinguished in so remarkable a degree the restrained, or more artificial expression of his features, and signed to her, with an air of authority, to give place. "Is not Tachechana the daughter of a chief?" demanded a subdued voice, in which pride struggled with anguish. "Were not her brothers braves?" "Go! The men are calling their partisan. He has no ears for a woman." "No," replied the supplicant, "it is not the voice of Tachechana that you hear, but this boy, speaking with the tongue of his mother. He is the son of a chief, and his words will go up to his father's ears. Listen to what he says. When was Matori hungry, and Tachechana had not food for him? When did he go on the path of the Pawnees, and find it empty, that my mother did not weep? When did he come back with the marks of their blows, that she did not sing? What Sioux girl has given a brave son like me? Look at me well, that you may know me. My eyes are the eagle's. I look at the sun, and laugh in a little time the Dahcotahs will follow me to the hunts and on the war-path. Why does my father turn his eyes from the woman that gives me milk? Why has he so soon forgotten the daughter of a mighty Sioux?" There was a single instant, as the exulting father suffered his cold eye to wander to the face of the laughing boy, that the stern nature of the Teton seemed touched. But shaking off the grateful sentiment, like one who would gladly be rid of any painful, because reproachful, emotion, he laid his hand calmly on the arm of his wife, and led her directly in front of Inez. Pointing to the sweet countenance that was beaming on her own, with a look of tenderness and commiseration, he paused, to allow his wife to contemplate a loveliness, which was quite as excellent to her ingenuous mind, as it had proved dangerous to the character of her faithless husband. When he thought abundant time had passed to make the contrast sufficiently striking, he suddenly raised a small mirror, that dangled at her breast, an ornament he had himself bestowed, in an hour of fondness, as a compliment to her beauty, and placed her own dark image in its place. Wrapping his robe again about him, the Teton motioned to the trapper to follow, and stalked haughtily from the lodge, muttering as he went— "Matori is very wise. What nation has so great a chief as the Dahcotahs?" Tachechana stood frozen into a statue of humility. Her mild and usually joyous countenance worked, as if the struggle within was about to dissolve the connection between her soul and that more material part, whose deformity was becoming so loathsome. Inez and Ellen were utterly ignorant of the nature of her interview with her husband, though the quick and sharpened wits of the latter led her to suspect the truth, to which the entire innocence of the former furnished no clue. They were both, however, about to tender those sympathies, which are so natural to and so graceful in the sex, when their necessities seem suddenly to cease. The convulsions in the features of the young Sioux disappeared, and her countenance became cold and rigid, like chiselled stone. A single expression of subdued anguish, which had made its impression on a brow that had rarely before contracted with sorrow, alone remained. It was never removed in all the changes of seasons, fortunes, and years, which, in the vicissitudes of a suffering, female, savage life, she was subsequently doomed to endure. As in the case of a premature blight, let the plant quicken and revive as it may, the effects of that withering touch were always present. Tachechana first stripped her person of every vestige of those rude but highly prized ornaments, which the liberality of her husband had been wont to lavish on her, and she tendered them meekly, and without a murmur, as an offering to the superiority of Inez. The bracelets were forced from her wrist, the complicated mazes of beads from her leggings, and the broad silver band from her brow. Then she paused, long and painfully. But it would seem that the resolution she had once adopted was not to be conquered by the lingering emotions of any affection, however natural. The boy himself was next laid at the feet of her supposed rival, and well might the self-abased wife of the Teton believe that the burden of her sacrifice was now full. While Inez and Ellen stood regarding these several strange movements with eyes of wonder, a low, soft, musical voice was heard saying in a language that to them was unintelligible. "A strange tongue will tell my boy the manner to become a man. He will hear sounds that are new, but he will learn them and forget the voice of his mother. It is the will of the Wahcondah, and a Sioux girl should not complain. Speak to him softly, for his ears are very little. When he is big, your words may be louder. Let him not be a girl, for very sad is the life of a woman. Teach him to keep his eyes on the men. Show him how to strike them that do him wrong, and let him never forget to return blow for blow. When he goes to hunt, the flower of the pale-faces," she concluded, using in bitterness the metaphor which had been supplied by the imagination of her truant husband, "will whisper softly in his ears that the skin of his mother was red, and that she was once the fawn of the Dahcotahs." Tachechana pressed a kiss on the lips of her son, and withdrew to the farther side of the lodge. Here she drew her light calico robe over her head, and took her seat, in token of humility, on the naked earth. All efforts to attract her attention were fruitless. She neither heard remonstrances, nor felt the touch. Once or twice her voice rose, in a sort of wailing song, from beneath her quivering mantle, but it never mounted into the wildness of savage music. In this manner she remained unseen for hours, while events were occurring without the lodge, which not only materially changed the complexion of her own fortunes, but left a lasting and deep impression on the future movements of the wandering Sioux. Chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. "All know swaggerers. I am in good name and fame with the very best. Shut the door. There come no swaggers here. I have not lived all this while, to have swaggering now. Shut the door, I pray you." Shakespeare. Matori encountered, at the door of his lodge, Ishmael, Abiram, and Esther. The first glance of his eye, at the countenance of the heavy-moulded squatter, served to tell the cunning Teton that the treacherous truce he had made with these dupes of his superior sagacity was in some danger of a violent termination. "Look you here, old greybeard," said Ishmael, seizing the trapper, and whirling him round as if he had been a top, "that I am tired of carrying on a discourse with fingers and thumbs, instead of a tongue, are a natural fact. So you'll play linguister, and put my words into Indian, without much caring whether they suit the stomach of a red-skin or not." "Say on, friend," calmly returned the trapper. "They shall be given as plainly as you send them." "Friend!" repeated the squatter, eyeing the other for an instant, with an expression of indefinable meaning. "But it is no more than a word, and sounds break no bones, and survey no farms. Tell this thieving Sioux, then, that I come to claim the conditions of our solemn bargain made at the foot of the rock." When the trapper had rendered his meaning into the Sioux language, Matori demanded with an air of surprise— "Is my brother cold? Buffalo skins are plenty. Is he hungry? Let my young men carry venison into his lodges." The squatter elevated his clenched fist in a menacing manner, and struck it with violence on the palm of his open hand, by way of confirming his determination, as he answered— "Tell that deceitful liar I have not come like a beggar to pick his bones, but like a freeman asking for his own, and have it I will. And moreover, tell him I claim that you too, miserable sinner as you are, should be given up to justice. There's no mistake, my prisoner, my niece, and you. I demand the three at his hands according to a sworn agreement." The immovable old man smiled, with an expression of singular intelligence, as he answered— "Friend squatter, you ask what few men would be willing to grant. You would first cut the tongue from the mouth of the Teton, and then the heart from his bosom. It is little that Ishmael Bush regards, who or what is damaged in claiming his own. But put you the questions in straight-going Indian, and when you speak of yourself, make such a sign as a white man will understand, in order that I may know there is no foul play." The trapper laughed in his silent fashion, and muttered a few words to himself before he addressed the chief. "Let the Dahcotah open his ears very wide," he said, "that big words may have room to enter. His friend the Big Knife comes with an empty hand, and he says that the Teton must fill it. Wah! Matori is a rich chief. He is master of the prairies. He must give the dark hair." The brow of the chief contracted in an ominous frown, that threatened instant destruction to the audacious squatter, but as suddenly recollecting his policy, he craftily replied— "A girl is too light for the hand of such a brave. I will fill it with buffaloes." "He says he has need of the light hair, too, who has his blood in her veins." "She shall be the wife of Matori. Then the Long Knife will be the father of a chief." "And me," continued the trapper, making one of those expressive signs, by which the natives communicate, with nearly the same facility as with their tongues, and turning to the squatter at the same time, in order that the latter might see he dealt fairly by him. "He asks for a miserable and worn-out trapper." The Dahcotah threw his arm over the shoulder of the old man, with an air of great affection, before he replied to this third and last demand. "My friend is old," he said, "and cannot travel far. He will stay with the Tetons, that they may learn wisdom from his words. What Sioux has a tongue like my father? No, let his words be very soft, but let them be very clear. Matori will give skins and buffaloes. He will give the young men of the Pale-faces wives, but he cannot give away any who live in his own lodge." Perfectly satisfied himself with this laconic reply, the chief was moving towards his expecting counsellors, when suddenly returning, he interrupted the translation of the trapper by adding— "Tell the Great Buffaloe," a name by which the Tetons had already christened Ishmael, "that Matori has a hand which is always open. See," he added, pointing to the hand and wrinkled visage of the attentive Esther. "His wife is too old for so great a chief. Let him put her out of his lodge. Matori loves him as a brother. He is his brother. He shall have the youngest wife of the Teton. Tachechana, the pride of the Sioux girls, shall cook his venison, and many braves will look at him with longing minds. Go, a Dahcotah is generous." The singular coolness, with which the Teton concluded this audacious proposal, confounded even the practised trapper. He stared after the retiring form of the Indian, with an astonishment he did not care to conceal, nor did he renew his attempt at interpretation, until the person of Matori was blended with the cluster of warriors, who had so long, and with so characteristic patience, awaited his return. "The Teton chief has spoken very plainly," the old man continued. "He will not give you the lady, to whom the Lord in heaven knows you have no claim, unless it be such as the wolf has to the lamb. He will not give you the child you can call your niece, and therein I acknowledge that I am far from certain he has the same justice on his side. Moreover, neighbour squatter, he flatly denies your demand for me, miserable and worthless as I am, nor do I think he has been unwise in so doing, seeing that I should have many reasons against journeying far in your company. But he makes you an offer, which it is right and convenient you should know. The Teton says through me, who am no more than a mouthpiece, and therein not answerable for the sin of his words. But he says, as this good woman is getting past the comely age, it is reasonable for you to tire of such a wife. He therefore tells you to turn her out of your lodge, and when it is empty, he will send his own favourite, or rather she that was his favourite, the skipping fawn, as the Siouxes call her, to fill her place. You see, neighbour, though the Redskin is minded to keep your property, he is willing to give you wherewithal to make yourself some return." Ishmael listened to these replies to his several demands, with that species of gathering indignation, with which the dullest tempers mount into the most violent paroxysms of rage. He even affected to laugh at the conceit of exchanging his long-tried partner for the more flexible support of the youthful Tachechana, though his voice was hollow and unnatural in the effort. But Esther was far from giving the proposal so facetious a reception. Lifting her voice to its most audible key, she broke forth, after catching her breath, like one who had been in some imminent danger of strangulation, as follows. "Hoity toity! Who set an Indian up for a marker and breaker of the rights of wedded wives? Does he think a woman is a beast of the prairie, that she is to be chased from a village by dog and gun? Let the bravest squaw of them all come forth and boast of her doings. Can she show such a brood as mine? A wicked tyrant is that thieving Red-skin, and a bold rogue, I warrant me. He would be captain indoors as well as out. An honest woman is no better in his eyes than one of your broomstick jumpers. And you, Ishmael Bush, the father of 7 sons and so many comely daughters, to open your sinful mouth, except to curse him? Would ye disgrace colour and family and nation, by mixing white blood with red, and would he be the parent of a race of mules? The devil has often tempted you, my man, but never before has he set so cunning a snare as this. Go back among your children, friend. Go, and remember that you are not a prowling bear, but a Christian man, and thank God that you are a lawful husband." The clamour of Esther was anticipated by the judicious trapper. He had easily foreseen that her meek temper would overflow at so scandalous a proposal as repudiation, and he now profited by the tempest, to retire to a place where he was at least safe from any immediate violence on the part of her less excited, but certainly more dangerous husband. Ishmael, who had made his demands with a stout determination to enforce them, was diverted by the windy torrent, like many a more obstinate husband, from his purpose, and in order to appease a jealousy that resembled the fury with which the bear defends her cubs, was fain to retire to a distance from the lodge, that was known to contain the unoffending object of the sudden uproar. "Let your copper-coloured minx come forth, and show her tawny beauty before the face of a woman who has heard more than one church bell, and seen the power of real quality," cried Esther, flourishing her hand in triumph, as she drove Ishmael and Abiram before her, like 2 truant boys, towards their own encampment. I warrant me, here is one who would shortly talk her down. Never think to tarry here, my men. Never think to shut an eye in a camp, through which the devil walks as openly as if he were a gentleman, and sure of his welcome. Here, you, Abner, Enoch, Jesse, where are ye gotten to? Put to, if that weak-minded, soft-feeling man, your father, eats or drinks again in this neighbourhood, we shall see him poisoned with the craft of the Redskins. Not that I care, I, who comes into my place, when it is once lawfully empty. But, Ishmael, I never thought that you, who had one woman with a white skin, would find pleasure in looking on a brazen, ay, that she is a copper, are a fact. You can't deny it, and I warrant me, brazen enough is she too." Against this ebullition of wounded female pride, the experienced husband made no other head, than by an occasional exclamation, which he intended to be precursor of a simple asseveration of his own innocence. The fury of the woman would not be appeased. She listened to nothing but her own voice, and consequently nothing was heard but her mandates to depart. The squatter had collected his beasts and loaded his wagons, as a measure of precaution, before proceeding to the extremity he contemplated. Esther consequently found everything favourable to her wishes. The young men stared at each other, as they witnessed the extraordinary excitement of their mother, but took little interest in an event which, in the course of their experience, had found so many perils. By command of their father, the tents were thrown into the vehicles, as a sort of reprisal for the want of faith in their late ally, and then the train left the spot in its usual listless and sluggish order. As a formidable division of well-armed borderers protected the rear of the retiring party, the Sioux saw it depart without manifesting the smallest evidence of surprise or resentment. The savage, like the tiger, rarely makes his attack on an enemy who expects him, and if the warriors of the Tetons meditated any hostility, it was in the still and patient manner with which the feline beast watched for the incautious moment, in order to ensure the blow. The counsels of Matori, however, on whom so much of the policy of his people depended, lay deep in the depository of his own thoughts. Perhaps he rejoiced at so easy a manner of getting rid of claims so troublesome. Perhaps he awaited a fitting time to exhibit his power, Or it even might be that matters of so much greater importance were pressing on his mind, that it had not the leisure to devote any of its faculties to an event of so much indifference. But it would seem, that while Ishmael made such a concession to the awakened feelings of Esther, he was far from abandoning his original intentions. His train followed the course of the river for a mile, and then it came to a halt on the brow of the elevated land, and in a place which afforded the necessary facilities. Here he again pitched his tents, unharnessed his teams, sent his cattle on the bottom, and, in short, made all the customary preparations to pass the night with the same coolness and deliberation, as if he had not hurled an irritating defiance into the teeth of his dangerous neighbours. In the meantime, the Tetons proceeded to the more regular business of the hour. A fierce and savage joy had existed in the camp, from the instant when it had been announced that their own chief was returning with the long-dreaded and hated partisan of their enemies. For many hours the crones of the tribe had been going from lodge to lodge, in order to stimulate the tempers of the warriors to such a pass as might leave but little room for mercy. To one they spoke of a son, whose scalp was drying in the smoke of a Pawnee lodge. To another they enumerated his own scars, his disgraces and defeats. With a third they dwelt on his losses of skins and horses, and a fourth was reminded of vengeance by a significant question concerning some flagrant adventure, in which he was known to have been a sufferer. By these means the men had been so far excited as to have assembled in the manner already related, though it still remained a matter of doubt how far they intended to carry their revenge. A variety of opinions prevailed on the policy of executing their prisoners, and Matori had suspended the discussions, in order to ascertain how far the measure might propitiate or retard his own particular views. Hitherto the consultations had merely been preliminary, with the design that each chief might discover the number of supporters his particular views would be likely to obtain, when the important subject should come before a more solemn council of the tribe. The moment for the latter had now arrived, and the preparations were made with a dignity and solemnity suited to the momentous interest of the occasion. With a refinement and cruelty that none but an Indian would have imagined, the place, selected for this grave deliberation, was immediately about the post to which the most important of its subjects was attached. Middleton and Paul were brought in their bonds, and laid at the feet of the Pawnee. Then the men began to take their places, according to their several claims to distinction. As warrior after warrior approached, he seated himself in the wide circle, with a mien as composed and thoughtful as if his mind were actually in a condition to deal out justice, tempered, as it should be, with the heavenly quality of mercy. A place was reserved for 3 or 4 of the principal chiefs, and a few of the oldest of the women, as withered as age, exposure, hardships, and lives of savage passions could make them, thrust themselves into the foremost circle, with a temerity to which they were impelled by their insatiable desire for cruelty, and which nothing but their years and their long-tried fidelity to the nation would have excused. All but the chiefs already named were now in their places. These had delayed their appearance, in the vain hope that their own unanimity might smooth the way to that of their respective factions, for, notwithstanding the superior influence of Matori, his power was to be maintained only by constant appeals to the opinions of his inferiors. As these important personages at length entered the circle in a body, their sullen looks and clouded brows, notwithstanding the time given to consultation, sufficiently proclaimed the discontent which reigned amongst them. The eye of Matori was varying in its expression, from sudden gleams that seemed to kindle with the burning impulses of his soul, to that cold and guarded steadiness, which was thought more peculiarly to become a chief in council. He took his seat with the studied simplicity of a demagogue, though the keen and flashing glance that he immediately threw around the silent assembly betrayed the more predominant temper of a tyrant. When all were present, an aged warrior lighted the great pipe of his people, and blew the smoke towards the 4 quarters of the heavens. So soon as this propitiatory offering was made, he tendered it to Matori, who, in affected humility, passed it to a grey-headed chief by his side. After the influence of the soothing weed had been courted by all, a grave silence succeeded, as if each was not only qualified to, but actually did, think more deeply on the matters before them. Then an old Indian arose, and spoke as follows.
The eagle, at the falls of the endless river, was in its egg, many snows after my hand had struck a Pawnee. What my tongue says, my eyes have seen. Bocorina is very old. The hills have stood longer in their places, than he has been in his tribe, and the rivers were full and empty before he was born. But where is the Sioux that knows it besides himself? What he says, they will hear. If any of his words fall to the ground, they will pick them up and hold them to their ears. If any blow away in the wind, my young men, who are very nimble, will catch them. Now listen. Since water ran and trees grew, the Sioux has found the Pawnee on his warpath. As the cougar loves the antelope, the Dakota loves his enemy. When the wolf finds the fawn, does he lie down and sleep? When the panther sees the doe at the spring, does he shut his eyes? You know that he does not. He drinks too, but it is of blood. A Sioux is a leaping panther, a Pawnee a trembling deer. Let my children hear me. They will find my words good. I have spoken." A deep, guttural exclamation of assent broke from the lips of all the partisans of Matori, as they listened to this sanguinary advice from one who was certainly among the most aged men of the nation. That deeply seated love of vengeance, which formed so prominent a feature in their characters, was gratified by his metaphorical allusions, and the chief himself augured favourably of the success of his own schemes, by the number of supporters who manifested themselves to be in favour of the counsels of his friend. But still unanimity was far from prevailing. A long and decorous pause was suffered to succeed the words of the first speaker, in order that all might duly deliberate on their wisdom, before another chief took on himself the office of refutation. The second orator, though past the prime of his days, was far less aged than the one who had preceded him. He felt the disadvantage of this circumstance, and endeavoured to counteract it, as far as possible, by the excess of his humility. "I am but an infant," he commenced, looking furtively about him, in order to detect how far his well-established character for prudence and courage contradicted his assertion. "I have lived with the woman, since my father has been a man. If my head is getting grey, it is not because I am old. Some of the snow, which fell on it while I have been sleeping on the war-paths, has frozen there, and the hot sun, near the Osage villages, has not been strong enough to melt it." A low murmur was heard, expressive of admiration of the services to which he thus artfully alluded. The orator modestly awaited for the feeling to subside a little, and then he continued with increasing energy, encouraged by their commendations. "But the eyes of a young brave are good. He can see very far. He is a lynx. Look at me well. I turn my back, that you may see both sides of me. Now do you know I am your friend, for you look on a part that a Pawnee never yet saw. Now look at my face, not in this seam, for there your eyes can never see into my spirit. It is a hole cut by a Kanza, but here is an opening made by a Wakanda, through which you may look into the soul. What am I? A Dakota, within and without. You know it. Therefore hear me. The blood of every creature on the prairie is red. Who can tell the spot where a Pawnee was struck from the place where my young men took a bison? It is of the same colour. The Master of Life have made them for each other. He made them alike, but will the grass grow green where a pale-face is killed? My young men must not think that nation so numerous that it will not miss a warrior. They call them over often, and say, 'Where are my sons?' If they miss one, they will send into the prairies to look for him. If they cannot find him, they will tell their runners to ask for him among the Sioux. My brethren, the Big Knives are not fools. There is a mighty medicine of their nation now among us. Who can tell how loud is his voice, or how long is his arm?" The speech of the orator, who was beginning to enter into his subject with warmth, was cut short by the impatient Matori, who suddenly arose and exclaimed, in a voice in which authority was mingled with contempt, and at the close with a keen tone of irony also. "Let my young men lead the evil spirit of the Pale-faces to the council. My brother shall see his medicine, face to face." A death-like and solemn stillness succeeded his extraordinary interruption. It not only involved a deep offence against the sacred courtesy of debate, but the mandate was likely to brave the unknown power of one of those incomprehensible beings, whom few Indians were enlightened enough, at that day, to regard without reverence, or few hardy enough to oppose. These subordinates, however, obeyed, and Obed was led forth from the lodge, mounted on Asinus, with a ceremony and state which was certainly intended for derision, but which nevertheless was greatly enhanced by fear. As they entered the ring, Matori, who had foreseen and had endeavoured to anticipate the influence of the Doctor, by bringing him into contempt, cast an eye around the assembly, in order to gather his success in the various dark visages by which he was encircled. Truly, nature and art had combined to produce such an effect from the air and appointments of the naturalist, as might have made him the subject of wonder in any place. His head had been industriously shaved, after the most approved fashion of Sioux taste. A gallant scalp lock, which would probably not have been spared had the Doctor himself been consulted in the matter, was all that remained of an exuberant, and at that particular season of the year, far from uncomfortable head of hair. Thick coats of paint had been laid on the naked poll, and certain fanciful designs in the same material had even been extended into the neighbourhood of the eyes and the mouth, lending to the keen expression of the former a look of twinkling cunning, and to the dogmatism of the latter not a little of the grimness of necromancy. He had been despoiled of his upper garments, and in their stead his body was sufficiently protected from the cold by a fantastically painted robe of dressed deerskin. As if in mockery of his pursuit, sundry toads, frogs, lizards, butterflies, and all, duly prepared to take their places at some future day, in his own private cabinet, were attached to the solitary lock on his head, to his ears, and to the various other conspicuous parts of his person. If, in addition to the effect produced by these quaint auxiliaries to his costume, we add the portentous and troubled gleamings of doubt, which rendered his visage doubly austere, and proclaimed the misgivings of the worthy Obed's mind, as he beheld his personal dignity thus prostrated, and what was of far greater moment in his eyes, himself led forth, as he firmly believed, to be the victim of some heathenish sacrifice, the reader will find no difficulty in giving credit to the sensation of awe that was excited by his appearance in a band already more than half prepared to worship him as a powerful agent of the evil spirit. Weucha led Asinus directly into the centre of the circle, and leaving them together, for the legs of the naturalist were attached to the beast in such a manner, that the two animals might be said to be incorporated, and to form a new order. He withdrew to his proper place, gazing at the conjuror, as he retired, with a wonder and admiration that were natural to the grovelling dullness of his mind. The astonishment seemed mutual, between the spectators and the subject of this strange exhibition. If the Tetons contemplated the mysterious attributes of the medicine with awe and fear, the Doctor gazed on every side of him with a mixture of quite as many extraordinary emotions, in which the latter sensation, however, formed no inconsiderable ingredient. Everywhere his eyes, which just at that moment possessed a secret magnifying quality, seemed to rest on several dark, savage, and obdurate countenances at once, from none of which could he extract a solitary gleam of sympathy or commiseration. At length his wandering gaze fell on the grave and decent features of the trapper, who, with Hector at his feet, stood in the edge of the circle, leaning on that rifle which he had been permitted, as an acknowledged friend, to resume, and apparently musing on the events that were likely to succeed a council, marked by so many and such striking ceremonies. "Venerable venerator, or hunter, or trapper," said the disconsolate Obed, "I rejoice greatly in meeting thee again. I fear that the precious time, which had been allotted me in order to complete a mighty labour, is drawing to a premature close, and I would gladly unburden my mind to one who, if not a pupil of science, has at least some of the knowledge which civilisation imparts to its meanest subjects. Doubtless, many and earnest enquiries will be made after my fate by the learned societies of the world, and perhaps expeditions will be sent into these regions to remove any doubts which may arise on so important a subject. I esteem myself happy that a man who speaks the vernacular is present, to preserve the record of my end. You will say that after a well spent and glorious life, I died a martyr to science, and a victim to mental darkness. As I expect to be particularly calm and abstracted in my last moments, if you add a few details, concerning the fortitude and scholastic dignity with which I met my death, it may serve to encourage future aspirants for similar honours, and assuredly give offence to no one. And now, friend trapper, as a duty I owe to human nature, I will conclude by demanding if all hope has deserted me, or if any means still exist by which so much valuable information may be rescued from the grasp of ignorance, and preserved to the pages of natural history." The old man lent an attentive ear to this melancholy appeal, and apparently he reflected on every side of the important question before he would have presumed to answer. "I take it, friend physicianer," he at length gravely replied, "that the chances of life and death, in your particular case, depend altogether on the will of Providence, as it may be pleased to manifest it, through the accursed windings of Indian cunning. For my own part, I see no great difference in the main end to be gained, inasmuch as it can matter no one greatly, yourself excepted, whether you live or die." "Would you account the fall of a corner stone, from the foundations of the edifice of learning, a matter of indifference to contemporaries or to posterity?" interrupted Obed. "Besides, my aged associate," he reproachfully added, "the interest that a man has in his own existence is by no means trifling, however it may be eclipsed by his devotion to more general and philanthropic feelings." "What I would say is this," resumed the trapper, who was far from understanding all the subtle distinctions with which his more learned companion so often saw fit to embellish his discourse. "There is but one birth and one death to all things, be it hound or be it deer, be it red skin or be it white. Both are in the hands of the Lord, it being as unlawful for man to strive to hasten the one, as impossible to prevent the other. But I will not say that something may not be done to put the last moment aside, for a while at least, and therefore it is a question, that any one has a right to put to his own wisdom, how far he will go, and how much pain he will suffer, to lengthen out a time that may have been too long already. Many a dreary winter and scorching summer has gone by since I have turned to the right hand or to the left, to add an hour to a life that has already stretched beyond fourscore years. I keep myself as ready to answer to my name as a soldier at evening roll call. In my judgment, if your cases are left to Indian tempers, the policy of the Great Sioux will lead his people to sacrifice you all. Nor do I put much dependence on his seeming love for me. Therefore it becomes a question whether you are ready for such a journey, and, if being ready, whether this is not as good a time to start as another. Should my opinion be asked, thus far will I give it in your favour. That is to say, it is my belief your life has been innocent enough, touching any great offences that you may have committed, though honesty compels me to add, that I think all you can lay claim to on the score of activity and deeds will not amount to anything worth naming in the great account." Obed turned a rueful eye on the calm, philosophic countenance of the other, as he answered with so discouraging a statement of his case, clearing his throat, as he did so, in order to conceal the desperate concern which began to beset his faculties, with a vestige of that pride which rarely deserts poor human nature, even in the greatest emergencies. "I believe, venerable hunter," he replied, "considering the question in all its bearings, and assuming that your theory is just, it will be the safest to conclude that I am not prepared to make so hasty a departure, and that measures of precaution should be, forthwith, resorted to." "Being in that mind," returned the deliberate trapper, "I will act for you as I would for myself. Though, as time has begun to roll down the hill with you, I will just advise that you look to your case speedily, for it may so happen that your name will be heard, when quite as little prepared to answer to it as now." With this amicable understanding, the old man drew back again into the ring, where he stood musing on the course he should now adopt, with the singular mixture of decision and resignation that proceeded from his habits and his humility, and which united to form a character, in which excessive energy and the most meek submission to the will of Providence were oddly enough combined. Chapter 27. The Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. "The witch in Smithfield shall be burned to ashes, and you 3 shall be strangled on the gallows." Shakespeare. The Sioux had awaited the issue of the foregoing dialogue with commendable patience. Most of the band were restrained by the secret awe
with which they regarded the mysterious character of Obed, while a few of the more intelligent chiefs gladly profited by the opportunity to arrange their thoughts for the struggle that was plainly foreseen. Matori, influenced by neither of these feelings, was content to show the trapper how much he conceded to his pleasure, and when the old man discontinued the discourse, he received from the chief a glance, that was intended to remind him of the patience with which he had awaited his movements. A profound and motionless silence succeeded the short interruption. Then Matori arose, evidently prepared to speak. First, placing himself in an attitude of dignity, he turned a steady and severe look on the whole assembly. The expression of his eye, however, changed as it glanced across the different countenances of his supporters and of his opponents. To the former the look, though stern, was not threatening, while it seemed to tell the latter all the hazards they incurred in daring to brave the resentment of one so powerful. Still, in the midst of so much hauteur and confidence, the sagacity and cunning of the Teton did not desert him. When he had thrown the gauntlet, as it were, to the whole tribe, and sufficiently asserted his claim to superiority, his mien became more affable, and his eye less angry. Then it was that he raised his voice, in the midst of a deathlike stillness, varying its tones to suit the changing character of his images and of his eloquence. "What is a Sioux?" the chief sagaciously began. "He is the ruler of the prairies, and master of its beast. The fishes in the river of troubled waters know him, and come at his call. He is a fox in council, an eagle in sight, a grizzly bear in combat. A Dakota is a man." After waiting for the low murmur of approbation, which followed this flattering portrait of his people, to subside, the Teton continued. "What is a Pawnee? A thief, who only steals from women. A redskin, who is not brave. A hunter, that begs for his venison. In council he is a squirrel, hopping from place to place. He is an owl, that goes on the prairies at night. In battle he is an elk, whose legs are long. A Pawnee is a woman." Another pause succeeded, during which a yell of delight broke from several mouths, and a demand was made that the taunting words should be translated to the unconscious subject of their biting contempt. The old man took his cue from the eyes of Matori, and complied. Hard Heart listened gravely, and then, as if apprised that his time to speak had not arrived, he once more bent his look on the vacant air. The orator watched his countenance, with an expression that manifested how inextinguishable was the hatred he felt for the only chief, far and near, whose fame might advantageously be compared with his own. Though disappointed in not having touched the pride of one whom he regarded as a boy, he proceeded, what he considered as far more important, to quicken the tempers of the men of his own tribe, in order that they might be prepared to work his savage purposes. "If the earth was covered with rats, which are good for nothing," he said, "there would be no room for buffaloes, which give food and clothes to an Indian. If the prairies were covered with Pawnees, there would be no room for the foot of a Dakota. A Loup is a rat, a Sioux a heavy buffalo. Let the buffaloes tread upon the rats, and make room for themselves. My brothers, a little child has spoken to you. He tells you his hair is not grey, but frozen, that the grass will not grow where a pale-face has died. Does he know the colour of the blood of a Big Knife? No. I know he does not. He has never seen it. What Dakota, besides Matori, has ever struck a pale-face? Not one. But Matori must be silent. Every Teton will shut his ears when he speaks. The scalps over his lodge were taken by the women. They were taken by Matori, and he is a woman. His mouth is shut. He waits for the feast to sing among the girls." Notwithstanding the exclamations of regret and resentment which followed so abasing a declaration, the chief took his seat, as if determined to speak no more. But the murmurs grew louder and more general, and there were threatening symptoms that the council would dissolve itself in confusion, and he arose and resumed his speech, by changing his manner to the fierce and hurried enunciation of a warrior bent on revenge. "Let my young men go look for Tetao," he cried.
They will find his scalp drying in Pawnee smoke. Where is the son of Bohrecheena? His bones are whiter than faces of his murderers. Is Mahhah asleep in his lodge? You know it is many moons since he started for the blessed prairies. Would he were here, that he might say of what colour was the hand that took his scalp." In this strain the artful chief continued for many minutes, calling those warriors by name, who were known to have met their deaths in battle with the Pawnees, or in some of those lawless frays which so often occurred between the Sioux bands and a class of white men, who were but little removed from them in the qualities of civilization. Time was not given to reflect on the merits, or rather the demerits, of most of the different individuals to whom he alluded, in consequence of the rapid manner in which he ran over their names. But so cunningly did he time his events, and so thrillingly did he make his appeals, aided as they were by the power of his deep tone and stirring voice, that each of them struck an answering chord in the breast of some one of his auditors. It was in the midst of one of his highest flights of eloquence, that a man, so aged as to walk with the greatest difficulty, entered the very centre of the circle, and took his stand directly in front of the speaker. An ear of great acuteness might possibly have detected that the tones of the orator faltered a little, as his flashing look first fell on this unexpected object, though the change was so trifling, that none but such as thoroughly knew the parties would have suspected it. The stranger had once been as distinguished for his beauty and proportions, as had been his eagle eye for its irresistible and terrible glance. But his skin was now wrinkled, and his features furrowed with so many scars, as to have obtained for him, half a century before, from the French of the Canadas, a title which had been borne by so many of the heroes of France, and which had now been adopted into the language of the wild horde of whom we are writing, as the one most expressive of the deeds of their own brave. The murmur of "La belle affaire" that ran through the assembly, when he appeared, announced not only his name and the high estimation of his character, but how extraordinary his visit was considered. As he neither spoke nor moved, however, the sensation created by his appearance soon subsided, and then every eye was again turned upon the speaker, and every ear once more drunk in the intoxication of his maddening appeals. It would have been easy to have traced the triumph of Matori in the reflecting countenances of his auditors. It was not long before a look of ferocity and of revenge was to be seen seated on the grim visages of most of the warriors, and each new and crafty allusion to the policy of extinguishing their enemies was followed by fresh and less restrained bursts of approbation. In the height of this success, the Teton closed his speech by a rapid appeal to the pride and hardihood of his native band, and suddenly took a seat. In the midst of the murmurs of applause, which succeeded so remarkable an effort of eloquence, a low, feeble, and hollow voice was heard rising on the ear, as if it rolled from the inmost cavities of the human chest, and gathered strength and energy as it issued into the air. A solemn stillness followed the sounds, and then the lips of the aged man were first seen to move. "The day of La Belle Affaire is near its end," were the first words that were audible. "He is like a buffaloe, on whom the hair will grow no longer. He will soon be ready to leave his lodge, to go in search of another, that is far from the villages of the Sioux. Therefore what he has to say concerns not him, but those he leaves behind him. His words are like the fruit on the tree, ripe and fit to be given to chiefs. Many snows have fallen since La Belle Affaire has been found on the war-path. His blood has been very hot, but it has had time to cool. The Wahcondah gives him dreams of war no longer. He sees that it is better to live in peace. My brothers, one foot is turned to the happy hunting grounds, the other will soon follow, and then an old chief will be seen looking for the prints of his father's moccasins, that he may make no mistake, but be sure to come before the Master of Life, by the same path as so many good Indians have already travelled. But who will follow? La Belle Affaire has no son. His oldest has ridden too many Pawnee horses. The bones of the youngest have been gnawed by Konza dogs. Le Balafré has come to look for a young arm on which he may lean, and to find a son, that when he is gone his lodge may not be empty. Tachechana, the skipping fawn of the Tetons, is too weak to prop a warrior who is old. She looks before her, and not backwards. Her mind is in the lodge of her husband."
The enunciation of the veteran warrior had been calm, but distinct and decided. His declaration was received in silence, and though several of the chiefs, who were in the councils of Matori, turned their eyes on their leader, none presumed to oppose so aged and so venerated a brave, in a resolution that was strictly in conformity to the usages of the nation. The Teton himself was content to await the result with seeming composure, though the gleams of ferocity that played about his eye occasionally betrayed the nature of those feelings with which he witnessed a procedure that was likely to rob him of that one of all his intended victims whom he most hated. In the meantime, Le Balafré moved with a slow and painful step towards the captives. He stopped before the person of Hard Heart, whose faultless form, unchanging eye, and lofty mien he contemplated long, with high and evident satisfaction. Then, making a gesture of authority, he awaited, until his order had been obeyed, and the youth was released from the post and his bonds by the same blow of the knife. When the young warrior was led nearer to his dim and failing sight, the examination was renewed with strictness of scrutiny, and that admiration which physical excellence is so apt to excite in the breast of a savage. "It is good," the wary veteran murmured, when he found that all his skill in the requisites of a brave could detect no blemish. "This is a leaping panther. Does my son speak with the tongue of a Teton?" The intelligence, which lighted the eyes of the captive, betrayed how well he understood the question, but still he was far too haughty to communicate his ideas through the medium of a language that belonged to a hostile people. Some of the surrounding warriors explained to the old chief that the captive was a Pawnee Loup. "My son opened his eyes on the waters of the wolves," said Le Balafré, in the language of that nation, "but he will shut them in the bend of the river with a troubled stream. He was born a Pawnee, but he will die a Dahcotah. Look at me. I am a sycamore that once covered many with my shadow. The leaves are fallen, and the branches begin to drop, but a single sucker is springing from my roots. It is a little vine, and it winds itself about a tree that is green. I have long looked for one fit to grow by my side. Now I have found him. Le Balafré is no longer without a son. His name will not be forgotten when he is gone. Men of Tetons, I take this youth into my lodge." No one was bold enough to dispute a right that had so often been exercised by warriors far inferior to the present speaker, and the adoption was listened to, in grave and respectful silence. Le Balafré took his intended son by the arm, and leading him into the very centre of the circle, he stepped aside, with an air of triumph, in order that the spectators might approve of his choice. Matori betrayed no evidence of his intentions, but rather seemed to await a moment better suited to the crafty policy of his character. The more experienced and sagacious chiefs distinctly foresaw the utter impossibility of two partisans so renowned, so hostile, and who had so long been rivals in fame, as their prisoner and their native leader, existing amicably in the same tribe. Still the character of Le Balafré was so imposing, and the custom to which he had resorted so sacred, that none dared to lift a voice in opposition to the measure. They watched the result with increasing interest, but with a coldness of demeanour that concealed the nature of their inquietude. From this state of embarrassment, and as it might readily have proved of disorganization, the tribe was unexpectedly relieved by the decision of one of the most interested in the success of the aged chief's design. During the whole of the foregoing scene, it would have been difficult to have traced a single distinct emotion in the lineaments of the captive. He had heard his release proclaimed, with the same indifference as the order to bind him to the stake. But now, that the moment had arrived when it became necessary to make his election, he spoke in a way to prove that the fortitude, which had bought him so distinguished a name, had in no degree deserted him. "My father is very old.
"But he has not yet looked upon everything," said Hard Heart, in a voice so clear as to be heard by all in presence. "He has never seen a buffaloe change to a bat. He will never see a Pawnee become a Sioux." There was a suddenness, and yet a calmness, in the manner of delivering this decision, which assured most of the auditors that it was unalterable. The heart of Le Balafré, however, was yearning towards the youth, and the fondness of age was not so readily repulsed. Reproving the burst of admiration and triumph, to which the boldness of the declaration and the freshened hopes of revenge had given rise, by turning his gleaming eye around the band, the veteran again addressed his adopted child, as if his purpose was not to be denied. "It is well," he said. "Such are the words a brave should use, that the warriors may see his heart. The day has been when the voice of Le Balafré was loudest among the lodges of the Konzas. But the root of a white hair is wisdom. My child will show the Tetons that he is brave, by striking their enemies. Men of the Dahcotahs, this is my son." The Pawnee hesitated a moment, and then, stepping in front of the chief, he took his hard and wrinkled hand, and laid it with reverence on his head, as if to acknowledge the extent of his obligation. Then, recoiling a step, he raised his person to its greatest elevation, and looked upon the hostile band, by whom he was environed, with an air of loftiness and disdain, as he spoke aloud in the language of the Sioux. "Hard Heart has looked at himself, within and without. He has thought of all he has done in the hunts and the wars. Everywhere he is the same. There is no change. He is in all things a Pawnee. He has struck so many Tetons that he could never eat in their lodges. His arrows would fly backwards. The point of his lance would be on the wrong end. Their friends would weep at every whoop he gave. Their enemies would laugh. Do the Tetons know a Loup? Let them look at him again. His head is painted, his arm is flesh, his heart is rock. When the Tetons see the sun come from the Rocky Mountains, and move towards the land of the Pale faces, the mind of Hard Heart will soften, and his spirit will become Sioux. Until that day he will live and die a Pawnee." A yell of delight, in which admiration and ferocity were strangely mingled, interrupted the speaker, and but too clearly announced the character of his fate. The captive awaited a moment for the commotion to subside, and then, turning again to Le Balafré, he continued, in tones conciliating and kind, as if he felt the propriety of softening his refusal, in a manner not to wound the pride of one who would so gladly be his benefactor. "Let my father lean heavier on the fawn of the Dahcotahs," he said. "She is weak now, but as her lodge fills with young she will be stronger. See," he added, directing the eyes of the other to the earnest countenance of the attentive trapper, "Hard Heart is not without a grey head to show him the path to the blessed prairies. If he ever has another father, it shall be that just warrior." Le Balafré turned away in disappointment from the youth, and approached the stranger, who had thus anticipated his design. The examination between these two aged men was long, mutual, and curious. It was not easy to detect the real character of the trapper, through the mask which the hardships of so many years had laid upon his features, especially when aided by his wild and peculiar attire. Some moments elapsed before the Teton spoke, and then it was in doubt whether he addressed one like himself, or some wanderer of that race, who, he had heard, were spreading themselves like hungry locusts throughout the land. "The head of my brother is very white," he said, "but the eye of Le Balafré is no longer like the eagle's. Of what colour is his skin?" "The Wahcondah made me like these you see waiting for a Dahcotah judgment. But fair fowl had coloured me darker than the skin of a fox. What of that? Though the bark is ragged and riven, the heart of the tree is sound." "My brother is a Big Knife. Let him turn his face towards the setting sun, and open his eyes. Does he see the salt lake beyond the mountains?" "A time has been, Teton, when few could see the white on the eagle's head farther than I. But the glare of 77 winters has dimmed my eyes, and but little can I boast of sight in my latter days. Does the Sioux think a Pale face is a god, that he can look through hills?" "Then let my brother look at me. I am nigh him, and he can see that I am a foolish Red man. Why cannot his people see everything, since they crave all?"
"I understand you, chief, nor will I gainsay the justice of your words, seeing that they are too much founded in truth. But though born of the race you love so little, my worst enemy, not even a lying Mingo, would dare to say that I ever laid hands on the goods of another, except such as were taken in manful warfare, or that I ever coveted more ground than the Lord has intended each man to fill."
"And yet my brother has come among the Redskins to find a son?" The trapper laid a finger on the naked shoulder of Le Balafré, and looked into his scared countenance with a wistful and confidential expression, as he answered—
"Ay, but it was only that I might do good to the boy. If you think, Dahcotah, that I adopted the youth in order to prop my age, you do as much injustice to my good will, as you seem to know little of the merciless intentions of your own people. I have made him my son, that he may know that one is left behind him. Peace, Hector, peace. Is this decent, pup, when grey heads are counselling together, to break in upon their discourse, with the whinings of a hound? The dog is old, Teton, and though well taught in respect of behaviour, he is getting like ourselves, I fancy, something forgetful of the fashions of his youth."
Further discourse between these veterans was interrupted by a discordant yell, which burst at that moment from the lips of the dozen withered crones, who have already been mentioned as having forced themselves into a conspicuous part of the circle. The outcry was excited by a sudden change in the air of Hard Heart. When the old men turned towards the youth, they saw him standing in the very centre of the ring, with his head erect, his eye fixed on vacancy, one leg advanced and an arm a little raised, as if all his faculties were absorbed in the act of listening. A smile lighted his countenance for a single moment, and then the whole man sunk again into his former look of dignity and coldness, suddenly recalled to self-possession. The movement had been construed into contempt, and even the tempers of the chiefs began to be excited. Unable to restrain their fury, the women broke into the circle in a body, and commenced their attack by loading the captive with the most bitter revilings. They boasted of the various exploits, which their sons had achieved at the expense of the different tribes of the Pawnees. They undervalued his own reputation, and told him to look at Matori if he had ever yet seen a warrior. They accused him of having been suckled by a doe, and of having drunk in cowardice with his mother's milk. In short, they lavished upon their unmoved captive a torrent of that vindictive abuse, in which the women of the savages are so well known to excel, but which has been too often described to need a repetition here. The effect of this outbreaking was inevitable. Le Balafré turned away disappointed, and hid himself in the crowd, while the trapper, whose honest features were working with inward emotion, pressed nigher to his young friend, as those who are linked to the criminal, by ties so strong as to brave the opinions of men, are often seen to stand about the place of execution to support his dying moments. The excitement soon spread among the inferior warriors, though the chiefs still forbore to make the signal, which committed the victim to their mercy. Matori, who had awaited such a movement among his fellows, with the wary design of concealing his own jealous hatred, soon grew weary of delay, and by a glance of his eye encouraged the tormentors to proceed. Weucha, who, eager for this sanction, had long stood watching the countenance of the chief, bounded forward at the signal like a bloodhound loosened from the leash. Forcing his way into the centre of the hags, who were already proceeding from abuse to violence, he reproved their impatience and bade them wait, until a warrior began to torment, and then they should see their victim shed tears like a woman. The heartless savage commenced his efforts, by flourishing his tomahawk about the head of the captive, in such a manner as to give reason to suppose that each blow would bury the weapon in the flesh, while it was so governed as not to touch the skin. To this customary expedient Hard Heart was perfectly insensible. His eye kept the same steady, riveted look on the air, though the glittering axe described, in its evolutions, a bright circle of light before his countenance. Frustrated in this attempt, the callous Sioux laid the cold edge on the naked head of his victim, and began to describe the different manners in which a prisoner might be flayed. The women kept time to his cruelties with their taunts, and endeavoured to force some expression of the lingerings of nature from the insensible features of the Pawnee. But he evidently reserved himself for the chiefs, and for those moments of extreme anguish, when the loftiness of his spirit might evince itself in a manner better becoming his high and untarnished reputation. The eyes of the trapper followed every movement of the tomahawk with the interest of a real father, until, at length, unable to command his indignation, he exclaimed— "My son has forgotten his cunning. This is a low-minded Indian, and one easily hurried into folly. I cannot do the thing myself, for my traditions forbid a dying warrior to revile his persecutors, but the gifts of a Red-skin are different. Let the Pawnee say the bitter words and purchase an easy death. I will answer for his success, provided he speaks before the grave men set their wisdom to back the folly of this fool." The savage Sioux, who heard his words without comprehending their meaning, turned to the speaker and menaced him with death for his temerity. "Ay, work your will," said the unflinching old man. "I am as ready now as I shall be to-morrow, though it would be a death that an honest man might not wish to die. Look at that noble Pawnee, Teton, and see what a Red-skin may become, who fears the Master of Life, and follows his laws. How many of your people has he sent to the distant prairies?" he continued in a sort of pious fraud, thinking that while the danger menaced himself, there could surely be no sin in extolling the merits of another. "How many howling Siouxes has he struck, like a warrior in open combat, while arrows were sailing in the air plentier than flakes of falling snow? Go! Will Weucha speak the name of one enemy he has ever struck?" "Hard Heart!" shouted the Sioux, turning in his fury, and aiming a deadly blow at the head of his victim. His arm fell into the hollow of the captive's hand. For a single moment the two stood, as if entranced in that attitude, the one paralysed by so unexpected a resistance, and the other bending his head, not to meet his death, but in the act of the most intense attention. The women screamed with triumph, for they thought the nerves of the captive had at length failed him. The trapper trembled for the honour of his friend, and Hector, as if conscious of what was passing, raised his nose into the air, and uttered a piteous howl. But the Pawnee hesitated only for that moment. Raising the other hand like lightning, the tomahawk flashed in the air, and Weucha sunk to his feet, brain to the eye. Then, cutting away with the bloody weapon, he darted through the opening left by the frightened women, and seemed to descend the declivity at a single bound. Had a bolt from heaven fallen in the midst of the Teton band, it would not have occasioned greater consternation than this act of desperate hardihood. A shrill, plaintive cry burst from the lips of all women, and there was a moment that even the oldest warriors appeared to have lost their faculties. This stupor endured only for the instant. It was succeeded by a yell of revenge, that burst from 100 throats, while as many warriors started forward at the cry, bent on the most bloody retribution. But a powerful and authoritative call from Matori arrested every foot. The chief, in whose countenance disappointment and rage were struggling with the affected composure of his station, extended an arm towards the river, and the whole mystery was explained. Hard Heart had already crossed half the bottom, which lay between the acclivity and the water. At this precise moment, a band of armed and mounted Pawnees turned a swell, and galloped to the margin of the stream, into which the plunge of the fugitive was distinctly heard. A few minutes sufficed for his vigorous arm to conquer the passage, and then a shout from the opposite shore told the humble Tetons the whole extent of the triumph of their adversaries. Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. If that shepherd be not in hand fast, let him fly. The curses he shall have, the tortures he shall feel, will break the back of man, the heart of monster. Shakespeare. It will readily be seen that the event just related was attended by an extraordinary sensation among the Sioux. In leading the hunters of the band back to the encampment, their chief had neglected none of the customary precautions of Indian prudence, in order that his trail might escape the eyes of his enemies. It would seem, however, that the Pawnees had not only made the dangerous discovery, but had managed with great art to draw nigh the place, by the only side on which it was thought unnecessary to guard the approaches with the usual line of sentinels. The latter, who were scattered along the different eminences which lay in the rear of the lodges, were among the last to be apprized of the danger. In such a crisis there was little time for deliberation. It was by exhibiting the force of his character in scenes of similar difficulty, that Matori had obtained and strengthened his ascendancy among his people, nor did he seem likely to lose it by the manifestation of any indecision on the present occasion. In the midst of the screams of the young, the shrieks of the women, and the wild howlings of the crones, which were sufficient of themselves to have created a chaos in the thoughts of one less accustomed to act in emergencies, he promptly asserted his authority, issuing his orders with the coolness of a veteran. While the warriors were arming, the boys were dispatched to the bottom for the horses. The tents were hastily struck by the women, and disposed of on such of the beasts as were not deemed fit to be trusted in combat. The infants were cast upon the backs of their mothers, and those children, who were of a size to march, were driven to the rear, like a herd of less reasoning animals. Though these several movements were made amid outcries, and a clamour that likened the place to another Babel, they were executed with incredible alacrity and intelligence. In the meantime, Matori neglected no duty that belonged to his responsible station. From the elevation on which he stood, he could command a perfect view of the force and evolutions of the hostile party. A grim smile lighted his visage, when he found that, in point of numbers, his own band was greatly the superior. Notwithstanding this advantage, however, there were other points of inequality, which would probably have a tendency to render his success in the approaching conflict exceedingly doubtful. His people were the inhabitants of a more northern and less hospitable region than their enemies, and were far from being rich in that species of property, horses, and arms, which constitutes the most highly prized wealth of a western Indian. The band in view was mounted to a man, and as it had come so far to rescue or to revenge their greatest partisan, he had no reason to doubt its being composed entirely of braves. On the other hand, many of his followers were far better in a hunt than in a combat, men who might serve to divert the attention of his foes, but from whom he could expect little desperate service. Still, his flashing eye glanced over a body of warriors on whom he had often relied, and who had never deceived him. And though, in the precise position in which he found himself, he felt no disposition to precipitate the conflict, he certainly would have had no intention to avoid it, had not the presence of his women and children placed the option altogether in the power of his adversaries. On the other hand, the Pawnees, so unexpectedly successful in their first and greatest object, manifested no intention to drive matters to an issue. The river was a dangerous barrier to pass, in the face of a determined foe, and it would now have been in perfect accordance with their cautious policy, to have retired for a season, in order that their onset might be made in the hours of darkness and of seeming security. But there was a spirit in their chief that elevated him, for the moment, above the ordinary expedients of savage warfare. His bosom burned with the desire to wipe out that disgrace of which he had been the subject, and it is possible that he believed the retiring camp of the Sioux contained a prize that began to have a value in his eyes, far exceeding any that could be found in 50 Teton scalps. Let that be as it might, Hard Heart had no sooner received the brief congratulations of his band, and communicated to the chiefs such facts as were important to be known, than he prepared himself to act such a part in the coming conflict as would at once maintain his well-earned reputation, and gratify his secret wishes. A led horse, one that had been long trained in the hunts, had been brought to receive his master, with but little hope that his services would ever be needed again in this life. With a delicacy and consideration that proved how much the generous qualities of the youth had touched the feelings of his people, a bow, a lance, and a quiver were thrown across the animal, which it had been intended to immolate on the grave of the young brave. A species of care that would have superseded the necessity for the pious duty that the trapper had pledged himself to perform. Though Hard Heart was sensible of the kindness of his warriors, and believed that a chief, furnished with such appointments, might depart with credit for the distant hunting grounds of the Master of Life, he seemed equally disposed to think that they might be rendered quite as useful in the actual state of things. His countenance lighted with stern pleasure as he tried the elasticity of the bow, and poised the well-balanced spear. The glance he bestowed on the shield was more cursory and indifferent,
but the exultation with which he threw himself on the back of his favoured war horse was so great as to break through the forms of Indian reserve. He rode to and fro among his scarcely less delighted warriors, managing the animal with a grace and address that no artificial rules can ever supply, at times flourishing his lance as if to assure himself of his seat, and at others examining critically into the condition of the fusee, with which he had also been furnished, with the fondness of one who was miraculously restored to the possession of treasures that constituted his pride and his happiness. At this particular moment, Matori, having completed the necessary arrangements, prepared to make a more decisive movement. The Teton had found no little embarrassment in disposing of his captives. The tents of the squatter were still in sight, and his wary cunning did not fail to apprise him that it was quite as necessary to guard against an attack from that quarter as to watch the motions of his more open and more active foes. His first impulse had been to make the tomahawk suffice for the men, and to trust the females under the same protection as the women of his band. But the manner, in which many of his braves continued to regard the imaginary medicine of the Long knives, forewarned him of the danger of so hazardous an experiment on the eve of a battle. It might be deemed the omen of defeat. In this dilemma he motioned to a superannuated warrior, to whom he had confided the charge of the non-combatants, and leading him apart, he placed a finger significantly on his shoulder, as he said, in a tone in which authority was tempered by confidence— "When my young men are striking the Pawnees, give the women knives. Enough. My father is very old. He does not want to hear wisdom from a boy." The grim old savage returned a look of ferocious assent, and then the mind of the chief appeared to be at rest on this important subject. From that moment he bestowed all his care on the achievement of his revenge, and the maintenance of his martial character. Throwing himself on his horse, he made a sign, with the air of a prince, to his followers, to imitate his example, interrupting, without ceremony, the war songs and solemn rites by which many among them were stimulating their spirits to deeds of daring. When all were in order, the whole moved with great steadiness and silence towards the margin of the river. The hostile bands were now separated by the water. The width of the stream was too great to admit of the use of the ordinary Indian missiles, but a few useless shots were exchanged from the fusees of the chiefs, more in bravado than with any expectation of doing execution. As some time was suffered to elapse, in demonstrations and abortive efforts, we shall leave them, for that period, to return to such of our characters as remain in the hands of the savages. We have shed much ink in vain, and wasted queries that might possibly have been better employed, if it be necessary now to tell the reader that few of the foregoing movements escaped the observation of the experienced trapper. He had been, in common with the rest, astonished at the sudden act of Hard Heart, and there was a single moment when a feeling of regret and mortification got the better of his longings to save the life of the youth. The simple and well-intentioned old man would have felt, at witnessing any failure of firmness on the part of a warrior, who had so strongly excited his sympathies, the same species of sorrow that a Christian parent would suffer in hanging over the dying moments of an impious child. But when, instead of an impotent and unmanly struggle for existence, he found that his friend had forborne, with the customary and dignified submission of an Indian warrior, until an opportunity had offered to escape, and that he had then manifested the spirit and decision of the most gifted brave, his gratification became nearly too powerful to be concealed. In the midst of the wailing and commotion, which succeeded the death of Weucha and the escape of the captive, he placed himself nigh the persons of his white associates, with a determination of interfering, at every hazard, should the fury of the savages take that direction. The appearance of the hostile band spared him, however, so desperate and probably so fruitless an effort, and left him to pursue his observations, and to mature his plans more at leisure. He particularly remarked that, while by far the greater part of the women and all the children, together with the effects of the party, were hurried to the rear, probably with an order to secrete themselves in some of the adjacent woods, the tent of the Matori himself was left standing, and its contents undisturbed. 2 chosen horses, however, stood near by, held by a couple of youths, who were too young to go into the conflict, and yet of an age to understand the management of the beast. The trapper perceived in this arrangement the reluctance of Matori to trust his newly found flowers beyond the reach of his eye, and, at the same time, his forethought in providing against a reverse of fortune. Neither had the manner of the Teton in giving his commission to the old savage, nor the fierce pleasure with which the latter had received the bloody charge, escaped his observation. From all these mysterious movements, the old man was aware that a crisis was at hand, and he summoned the utmost knowledge he had acquired in so long a life to aid him in the desperate conjuncture. While musing on the means to be employed, the Doctor again attracted his attention to himself by a piteous appeal for assistance.
"Venerable trapper, or, as I may now say, liberator," commenced the dolorous Obed, "it would seem that a fitting time has at length arrived to dissever the unnatural and altogether irregular connection, which exists between my inferior members and the body of Asinus. Perhaps if such a portion of my limbs were released as might leave me master of the remainder, and this favourable opportunity were suitably improved by making a forced march towards the settlements, all hopes of preserving the treasures of knowledge, of which I am the unworthy receptacle, would not be lost. The importance of the results is surely worth the hazard of the experiment."
"I know not, returned the deliberate old man. "The vermin and reptiles which you bear about you were intended by the Lord for the prairies, and I see no good in sending them into regions that may not suit their natures. And moreover, you may be of great and particular use as you now sit on the ass, though it creates no wonder in my mind to perceive that you are ignorant of it, seeing that usefulness is altogether a new calling to so bookish a man."
"Of what service can I be in this painful thraldom, in which the animal functions are in a manner suspended, and the spiritual or intellectual blinded by the secret sympathy that unites mind to matter? There is likely to be blood spilt between yonder adverse hosts of heathens, and, though but little desiring the office, it would be better that I should employ myself in surgical experiments, than in thus wasting the precious moments, mortifying both soul and body."
"It is little that a Red-skin would care to have a physician at his hurts, while the whoop is ringing in his ears. Patience is a virtue in an Indian, and can be no shame to a Christian white man. Look at these hags of squaws, friend Doctor. I have no judgment in savage tempers, if they are not bloody-minded, and ready to work their accursed pleasures on us all. Now, so long as you keep upon the ass, and maintain the fierce look, which is far from being your natural gift, fear of so great a medicine may serve to keep down their courage. I am placed here like a general at the opening of the battle, and it has become my duty to make such use of all my force as, in my judgment, each is best fitted to perform. If I know these niceties, you will be more serviceable for your countenance just now than in any more stirring exploits."
"Harkee, old trapper," shouted Paul, whose patience could no longer maintain itself under the calculating and prolix explanations of the other. "Suppose you cut two things I can name, short off, that is to say, your conversation, which is agreeable enough over a well-baked buffalo's hump, and these damnable thongs of hide, which, according to my experience, can be pleasant nowhere. A single stroke of your knife would be of more service just now than the longest speech that was ever made in a Kentucky court-house."
"Ay, court-houses are the happy hunting grounds, as a Red-skin would say, for them that are born with gifts no better than such as lie in the tongue. I was carried into one of the lawless holes myself once, and it was all about a thing of no more value than the skin of a deer. The Lord forgive them, the Lord forgive them. They knew no better, and they did according to their weak judgments, and therefore the more are they to be pitied. And yet it was a solemn sight to see an aged man, who had always lived in the air, laid neck and heels by the law, and held up as a spectacle for the women and boys of a wasteful settlement to point their fingers at."
"If such be your opinions of confinement, honest friend, you had better manifest the same by putting us at liberty with as little delay as possible," said Middleton, who, like his companion, began to find the tardiness of his often tried companion quite as extraordinary as it was disagreeable.
"I should greatly like to do the same, especially in your behalf, Captain, who, being a soldier, might find not only pleasure but profit in examining more at your ease into the circumventions and cunning of an Indian fight. As to our friend here, it is but little matter how much of this affair he examines, or how little, seeing that a bee is not to be overcome in the same manner as an Indian."
"Old man, this trifling with our misery is inconsiderate, to give it a name no harsher."
"Ay, your grandfather was of a hot and hurrying mind, and one must not expect that the young of a panther will crawl the larth like the litter of a porcupine. Now keep you both silent, and what I say shall have the appearance of being spoken concerning the movements that are going on in the bottom, all of which will serve to put jealousy to sleep, and to shut the eyes of such as rarely close them on wickedness and cruelty. In the first place, then, you must know that I have reason to think yonder treacherous Teton has left an order to put us all to death, so soon as he thinks the deed may be done secretly and without tumult."
"Great Heaven! Will you suffer us to be butchered like unresisting sheep?"
"Hist, captain, hist. A hot temper is none of the best, when cunning is more needed than blows. Ah, the Pawnee is a noble boy. It would do your heart good to see how he draws off from the river, in order to invite his enemies to cross, and yet, according to my failing sight, they count 2 warriors to his 1. But as I was saying, little good comes of haste and thoughtlessness. The facts are so plain that any child may see into their wisdom, the savages of many minds, as to the manner of our treatment. Some fear us for cower, and would gladly let us go, and some would show us the mercy that the doe receives from the hungry wolf. When opposition gets fairly into the councils of a tribe, it is rarely that humanity is the gainer. Now see you these wrinkled and cruel-minded squaws? No, you cannot see them as you would lie, but nevertheless they are here, ready and willing, like so many raging she-bears, to work their will upon us so soon as the proper time shall come."
"Harkee, old gentleman trapper," interrupted Paul, with a little bitterness in his manner, "do you tell us these matters for our amusement, or for your own? If for ours, you may keep your breath for the next race you run, as I am tickled nearly to suffocation already with my part of the fun."
"Hist!" said the trapper, cutting with great dexterity and rapidity the thong, which bound one of the arms of Paul to his body, and dropping his knife at the same time within reach of the liberated hand. "Hist, boy, hist! That was a lucky moment. The yell from the bottom drew the eyes of these bloodsuckers in another quarter, and so far we are safe. Now make a proper use of your advantages, but be careful that what you do is done without being seen."
"Thank you for this small favour, old deliberation," muttered the bee hunter, "though it comes like a snow in May, somewhat out of season."
"Foolish boy!" reproachfully exclaimed the other, who had moved to a little distance from his friends, and appeared to be attentively regarding the movements of the hostile parties. "Will you never learn to know the wisdom of patience? And you too, captain, though a man myself, that seldom ruffles his temper by vain feelings, I see that you are silent, because you scorn to ask favours any longer from one you think too slow to grant them. No doubt ye are both young, and filled with the pride of your strength and manhood, and I dare say you thought it only needful to cut the thongs to leave you masters of the ground. But he that has seen much is apt to think much. Had I run like a bustling woman to have given you freedom, these hags of the Sioux would have seen the same, and then where would you both have found yourselves? Under the tomahawk and the knife, like helpless and outcrying children, though gifted with the size and beards of men. Ask our friend the bee hunter in what condition he finds himself to struggle with a Teton boy, after so many hours of bondage, much less with a dozen merciless and bloodthirsty squaws."
"Truly, old trapper," returned Paul, stretching his limbs, which were by this time entirely released, and endeavouring to restore the suspended circulation, "you have some judgmental notions in these matters. Now, here am I, Paul Hover, a man who will give in to few at wrestle or race, nearly as hapless as the day I paid my first visit to the house of old Paul, who is dead and gone. The Lord forgive him any little blunders he may have made while he tarried in Kentucky. Now there is my foot on the ground, so far as eyesight has any virtue, and yet it would take no great temptation to make me swear it didn't touch the earth by 6 inches. I say, honest friend, since you have done so much, have the goodness to keep these damnable squaws, of whom you say so many interesting things, at a little distance, till I have got the blood of this arm in motion, and am ready to receive them."
The trapper made a sign that he perfectly understood the case, and he walked towards the superannuated savage,
who began to manifest an intention of commencing his assigned task, leaving the bee hunter to recover the use of his limbs as well as he could, and to put Middleton in a similar situation to defend himself. Matori had not mistaken his man in selecting the one he did to execute his bloody purpose. He had chosen one of those ruthless savages, more or less of whom are to be found in every tribe, who had purchased a certain share of military reputation by the exhibition of a hardihood that found its impulses in an innate love of cruelty. Contrary to the high and chivalrous sentiment which among the Indians of the prairies renders it a deed of even greater merit to bear off the trophy of victory from a fallen foe, than to slay him, he had been remarkable for preferring the pleasure of destroying life, to the glory of striking the dead. While the more self-devoted and ambitious braves were intent on personal honour, he had always been seen, established behind some favourable cover, depriving the wounded of hope, by finishing that which a more gallant warrior had begun. In all the cruelties of the tribe he had ever been foremost, and no Sioux was so uniformly found on the side of merciless counsels. He had awaited, with an impatience which his long practised restraint could with difficulty subdue, for the moment to arrive when he might proceed to execute the wishes of the great chief, without whose approbation and powerful protection he would not have dared to undertake a step that had so many opposers in the nation. But events had been hastening to an issue between the hostile parties, and the time had now arrived, greatly to his secret and malignant joy, when he was free to act his will. The trapper found him distributing knives to the ferocious hags, who received the presents, chanting a low, monotonous song, that recalled the losses of their people in various conflicts with the whites, and which extolled the pleasures and glory of revenge. The appearance of such a group was enough of itself to have deterred one, less accustomed to such sights than the old man, from trusting himself within the circle of their wild and repulsive rites. Each of the crones, as she received the weapon, commenced a slow and measured but ungainly step around the savage, until the whole were circling him in a sort of magic dance. The movements were timed in some degree by the words of their songs, as were their gestures by the ideas. When they spoke of their own losses, they tossed their long straight locks of grey into the air, or suffered them to fall in confusion upon the withered necks. But as the sweetness of returning blow for blow was touched upon, by any among them, it was answered by a common howl, as well as by gestures that were sufficiently expressive of the manner in which they were exciting themselves to the necessary state of fury. Into the very centre of this ring of seeming demons the trapper now stalked, with the same calmness and observation as he would have walked into a village church. No other change was made by his appearance than a renewal of the threatening gestures, with, if possible, a still less equivocal display of their remorseless intentions. Making a sign for them to cease, the old man demanded, "Why do the mothers of the Tetons sing with bitter tongues? The Pawnee prisoners are not yet in their village. The young men have not come back loaded with scalps." He was answered by a general howl, and a few of the boldest of the furies even ventured to approach him, flourishing their knives within a dangerous proximity of his own steady eyeballs. "It is a warrior you see, and no runner of the Long knives, whose face grows paler at the sight of a tomahawk," returned the trapper, without moving a muscle. "Let the Sioux women think, if one White Skin dies, 100 spring up where he falls." Still the hags made no other answer, than by increasing their speed in the circle, and occasionally raising the threatening expressions of their chant into louder and more intelligible strains. Suddenly one of the oldest, and the most ferocious of them all, broke out of the ring and skirted away in the direction of her victims, like a rapacious bird, that having wheeled on poised wings, for the time necessary to ensure its object, makes the final dart upon its prey. The others followed, a disorderly and screaming flock, fearful of being too late to reap their portion of the sanguinary pleasure. "Mighty medicine of my people," shouted the old man in the Teton tongue, "lift your voice and speak, that the Sioux nation may hear." Whether Asinus had acquired so much knowledge by his recent experience as to know the value of his sonorous properties, or the strange spectacle of a dozen hags flitting past him, filling the air with such sounds as were even grating to the ears of an ass, most moved his temper, it is certain that the animal did that which Obed had requested to do, and probably with far greater effect, than if the naturalist had strove with his mightiest effort to be heard.
It was the first time the strange beast had spoken since his arrival in the encampment. Admonished by so terrible a warning, the hags scattered themselves, like vultures frightened from their prey, still screaming, and but half diverted from their purpose. In the meantime the sudden appearance, and the imminency of the danger, quickened the blood in the veins of Paul and Middleton more than all their laborious frictions and physical expedients. The former had actually risen to his feet, and assumed an attitude which perhaps threatened more than the worthy bee hunter was able to perform, and even the latter had mounted to his knees, and shown a disposition to do good service for his life. The unaccountable release of the captives from their bonds was attributed by the hags to the incantations of the medicine, and the mistake was probably of as much service as the miraculous and timely interposition of Asinus in their favour.
"Now is the time to come out of our ambushment,"
exclaimed the old man, hastening to join his friends,
"and to make open and manful war. It would have been policy to have kept back the struggle, until the captain was in better condition to join, but as we have unmasked our battery, why we must maintain the ground—"
He was interrupted by feeling a gigantic hand on his shoulder. Turning, under a sort of confused impression that necromancy was actually abroad in the place, he found that he was in the hands of a sorcerer no less dangerous and powerful than Ishmael Bush, the file of the squatter's well-armed sons, that was seen issuing from behind the still standing tent of Matori, explained at once, not only the manner in which their rear had been turned, while their attention had been so earnestly bestowed on matters in front, but the utter impossibility of resistance. Neither Ishmael nor his sons deemed it necessary to enter into prolix explanations. Middleton and Paul were bound again, with extraordinary silence and despatch, and this time not even the aged trapper was exempt from a similar fortune. The tent was struck, the females placed upon the horses, and the whole were on the way towards the squatter's encampment, with a celerity that might well have served to keep alive the idea of magic. During this summary and brief disposition of things, the disappointed agent of Matori and his callous associates were seen flying across the plain, in the direction of the retiring families, and when Ishmael left the spot with his prisoners and his booty, the ground, which had so lately been alive with the bustle and life of an extensive Indian encampment, was as still and empty as any other spot in those extensive wastes. Chapter 29.